Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I sensed something was wrong the very first night I spent alone in that house. The air felt heavy, as though the darkness clung to the corners and refused to let go. I remember standing in the living room with only a small lamp illuminating the wooden floorboards, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs. Even the silence felt unnatural, like a held breath before some dreadful exhalation. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of the relentless unease that would coil around my mind and refuse to let go. I moved into the old two-story home at the start of the year, attracted by its spacious rooms and tall windows that let in plenty of sunlight during the day. It was located right in the center of the city, a convenience for someone like me, who frequently had to run errands during business hours. From the outside, the place looked almost picturesque, a historical facade with decorative trim and a wide front porch. Inside, it seemed well maintained, though the wooden floors creaked at every step, and the walls had a slight musty smell. I didn't mind these minor flaws at first. They added character. The rent was surprisingly affordable, which in hindsight should have been my first red flag. My work as a freelance consultant often requires long hours, and I'm accustomed to starting tasks late in the afternoon and working deep into the night. Usually, I appreciate the solitude. The mental focus that comes from an empty, quiet space is a gift. But in this house, silence became a threat rather than a comfort. Around midnight on my second week there, I was hunched over my desk in the living room, editing some tedious documents, when I felt a slight chill across my neck, as though a breeze had passed by. That was odd, because all the windows were closed, locked, in fact. I glanced over my shoulder and saw only the dark outline of the staircase leading to the second floor. My initial reaction was to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the chill carried a presence, almost as if someone had walked behind me. I returned to my work, coaxing my rational mind to override my imagination. Then I heard the whisper. It was faint, almost blending with the distant hum of city traffic, but definitely there. It sounded like a breathy voice from upstairs, forming words I couldn't decipher. My first instinct was to stand up so quickly that my chair squeaked and toppled backward. My pulse was already racing, sweat forming on my palms. I told myself it was just old plumbing. Pipes in these historic homes can groan, hiss, or make all sorts of unusual noises. Determined to maintain composure, I walked upstairs to confirm there was nothing to worry about. The second floor had 2 bedrooms and a small hallway. The overhead light was dim, casting elongated shadows that seemed to shift along the walls. My footsteps were slow, each one pressing against the creaking boards. When I reached the top, I checked the rooms. Both were empty, pristine even, with no sign of an intruder or anything out of place. The hallway, however, felt stifling. A single window at the end let in a dim glow from the street lamp outside, but that only served to illuminate swirling dust motes in the stale air. I stood there listening, my heart pounding in my ears. The whisper was gone. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as though something hid behind the next corner. But I found nothing. Eventually, I whispered a small reassurance to myself, attempting to break the tension, then descended the stairs, forcing myself to focus on work again. The next few nights passed with relative calm. I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whisper due to stress. Yet, as the second month in the house began, the strange occurrences returned. The whispers would come late at night, just as I began to lose focus on my work. They were subtle at first, no more than a hushed murmur. I tried to brush them off, telling myself it was the wind outside or a neighboring apartment's muffled conversation. But they grew clearer. Sometimes I would hear what sounded like an urgent tone, as though 2 people were sharing secrets behind a closed door. Curiosity frequently got the better of me, compelling me to climb the staircase once more and check every room. But I always found the rooms empty and still, illuminated only by a feeble glow from the streetlights outside. My investigations became a nightly ritual of caution and unease. I'd stand on the landing, hardly breathing, ears straining to detect any trace of that elusive voice. Yet, as soon as I arrived upstairs, it would vanish, leaving only the sound of my thudding heartbeat. I told one of my neighbors about it in passing. He expressed concern, mentioning in an offhand way that old houses can have various quirks, drafty air vents, aging pipes, and even rodents in the walls. He insisted he never heard anything unusual from my place. He seemed sincere, but every time I mentioned how vivid the whispers were, he grew uncomfortable and changed the subject. Despite his attempts to reassure me that old buildings play tricks on the mind, I couldn't dismiss the nagging feeling that something was intentionally trying to get my attention. It became a tormenting loop. I would sit down at my desk, the hours would slide toward midnight, and then, without fail, the whispers would slither through the darkness. My senses started to turn against me in more ways than one. There were nights I felt sure I saw movement in my peripheral vision, a quick shadow darting across the window or down the hallway. When I turned, nothing was there. On a few occasions, I caught myself avoiding certain areas of the house, as though a silent voice inside my head warned me not to enter. My work began to suffer because I found it impossible to concentrate. The dryness in my mouth and the constant tension in my shoulders made me feel perpetually exhausted. Even simple tasks became steeped in dread. Flicking on a light switch at night made my hand tremble, expecting to see something unspeakable materialize in the hallway. As the weeks wore on, I started questioning my own sanity. I wondered if the stress of my job, coupled with the isolation of working alone at night, had led me to conjure these eerie experiences. Every creeping floorboard and flicker of a shadow was amplified by my anxious mind. Yet a grim part of me suspected that I was merely scratching the surface of something far more disturbing. My dreams became particularly fraught, filled with dark corridors and soft chanting that reverberated through my skull. I'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, uncertain if the whispers in my dreams were echoing through the real house, or if I was simply losing control of reality. One night, after I'd spent hours feeling that familiar tension coil in my chest, I took a step toward confrontation. I decided if something truly lurked upstairs, I had to see it for myself. Around 2 a.m, armed with a flashlight, I climbed the stairs in slow, deliberate steps. The floor moaned beneath me as though protesting my advance. I paused outside the first bedroom, inhaling deeply to steady my racing heart. The doorknob felt cold against my palm, and when I opened the door, an inexplicable sense of dread washed over me. The room was dark aside from the weak moonlight shining through the window. Nothing stirred. The closet door was ajar, revealing only hangers and a lone jacket I kept there. Yet, as I shone my flashlight into the corners, my nerves prickled. I felt certain I was not alone. I checked the second bedroom, which I used more as a storage space for my extra boxes and random belongings. This time, the whisper returned, so close it seemed to crawl over my shoulder. My flashlight beam trembled against the wall, and every hair on my body stood up in alarm. The voice was unintelligible, but urgent. The panic that surged in me nearly forced me to drop the flashlight and run. I spun around, expecting to come face to face with someone, or something, hunched in the darkness. But again, I saw nothing. The air was icy, though, leaving me shivering as I fought the urge to scream into the emptiness. After that night, I tried to block out the phenomena altogether. I threw myself into my work, attempting to drown out the tension by ignoring the late-night whispers. My neighbor mentioned I looked pale and jumpy whenever we crossed paths, but I only gave vague responses. I didn't want anyone to think I was losing my grip. The problem was, I could feel that grip slipping day by day. The house's once pleasant facade had transformed into a brooding presence. Even in daylight, the rooms felt oppressive, as if the house itself resented my attempts to deny its secrets. Every new night seemed heavier than the last. The floor creaks grew louder. There were times I heard a distinct footstep in the hallway above me, a calculated, singular step. I'd freeze, waiting for another step to confirm it wasn't my imagination, but nothing followed. My hands would shake, and a slick sheen of sweat would break out across my forehead. Sometimes I thought I felt the gentle press of invisible fingers along my arms or on the back of my neck, light touches that ignited jolts of cold terror. When I looked around, of course, there was never anyone there. Sleep deprivation and constant vigilance took a toll on my psyche. I began to question everything. I'd study the mirror in the bathroom to see if I recognized the face staring back, eyes ringed with dark circles, skin drawn tight. A few times, I thought I saw a presence reflected just over my shoulder. A tall shape, not quite defined, gone before I could fully register it. My breath would catch in my throat, and my pulse would thunder in my ears. I couldn't differentiate which experiences were real and which were conjured by my exhausted mind. It felt as though the house fed on my confusion, growing stronger with each moment of doubt. I tried playing music at night to drown out the unnerving hush, but it only served as a backdrop to distant murmurs. I attempted to call friends or acquaintances to keep me company, but people were rarely available in the small hours of the morning, and I didn't want to appear desperate by insisting there was something unexplainable happening. My neighbor reassured me repeatedly that everything must be in my head. He suggested that stress does strange things to the body and mind. I wished I could believe him. Part of me almost did. Eventually, I realized I couldn't live under that constant threat anymore. Something, either a trick of my overworked mind or a genuine haunting, was destroying my peace, and I had to confront it. One late evening, I decided to spend as much time upstairs as possible, forcing myself to stay in one of the bedrooms and observe whatever might happen. I brought my laptop, a lamp, and even a small snack, determined to last the night in that space. If it was all in my head, facing my fear might help dispel it. If there was truly something intangible lurking within the walls, then maybe showing I wasn't afraid would force it to retreat. I stationed myself in the larger bedroom, setting the lamp on the bedside table. The low glow cast flickering shadows that danced across the walls, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. Each minute stretched, and my heart wouldn't settle. By midnight, I was exhausted from straining my senses. Yet, just when I thought I could begin to relax, a prickling sensation coursed through me. The shadows on the wall seemed to stretch and contort in unnatural shapes. The air grew thick with that same stifling pressure I had felt so many times before. My mouth turned dry, and my heartbeat slammed against my chest. I forced myself to remain seated, despite my muscles screaming at me to run. A hush fell over the room, so profound it was deafening. Then I heard it again. A whisper, so clear this time it felt as though it was being spoken just inches from my ear. My entire body stiffened. The voice was insistent, neither male nor female, but charged with an unsettling energy that made my stomach lurch. I felt my mind teeter on the edge of panic. The wooden floor beneath my feet began to creak in slow, deliberate increments, as if unseen footsteps were circling me. In a surge of adrenaline, I snapped. My breath came in ragged gasps. Grabbing my lamp, I stood up and spun around, shining light into every corner. My vision blurred with tears of fear. That's when I caught sight of the shape, just for a fraction of a second. It was near the open bedroom door, a vague outline in the darkness, tall and unnaturally still. My heart seized. The lamp in my trembling hand flickered, and in the next moment, the shape was gone. I lunged for the door, nearly tripping over my own feet, and stumbled onto the landing. The hallway stretched out before me like the entrance to a crypt. The whisper was right behind me now, so close it made the hair on my neck prickle. I didn't think. I just ran. I barreled down the stairs, ignoring the desperate clamor in my head that told me it was chasing me, that it was about to reach out and seize me. My footsteps thundered against the creaking wood, and I nearly crashed into the living room wall as I reached the bottom. My heart felt like it would burst, and my lungs burned from the sudden sprint. I swore I heard the faint whisper continuing, though it could have been the sound of blood rushing through my ears. I dashed out the front door into the cool night air, hardly caring that I left every light burning inside. The streetlights cast their eerie glow over the empty sidewalk. I stood there, hands on my knees, struggling to steady my breath. For a few minutes, I simply stared at the house, trying to gather the courage to decide what to do next. The windows that once looked welcoming now seemed like dark, empty eyes peering at me, waiting for me to return. Eventually, I had to go back inside, at least to lock up and grab my belongings. But that night, I ended up leaving the house before dawn, driving aimlessly through the city streets until exhaustion forced me to pull over and rest. It became clear that my life in that house was not sustainable. No amount of reasoning or denial could erase what I had seen, or believed I had seen. The thought of staying another night was unbearable. The feeling that something was watching me, whispering to me, waiting for me to break, had grown too strong. Within a week, I arranged to move out. I told the landlord I needed to leave early due to personal reasons. He didn't press me for details, and I was grateful for that. I'll never fully know whether the house was genuinely haunted, or if my own psyche had unraveled under strain. But I do know the effect was terrifyingly real. Even in my new, brightly lit apartment, I occasionally wake to the memory of that chilling voice echoing in my mind. The experience left a stain on my thoughts, a quiet dread that surfaces whenever I find myself alone late at night. To this day, I can't decide which possibility is worse, that I was haunted by something inhuman, or that my own imagination conjured an unrelenting nightmare. Either way, the echoes of those whispers still haunt me, a reminder that sometimes we can't trust our own senses, and sometimes the most ordinary places hold secrets that defy explanation. Even now, I catch myself listening for those whispers in every creak of the floorboards or soft hum of the wind. My body tenses, expecting the worst, and I'm never entirely sure if the quiet I hear is truly silence, or just another whisper waiting to be heard. I remember the exact moment when I realized something was horribly wrong. It was a frigid evening, and I was alone in my living room, staring at the wooden figurine perched on my shelf. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed, with a sudden jolt of dread, that it was no longer angled the way I had left it that morning. Its carved face seemed to stare right back at me, as though it were silently demanding my attention. Everything in me screamed to look away, yet I felt compelled to keep my gaze locked on that small, disturbing effigy. In that fleeting instant, the air around me grew dense, cold, and suffocating. An unnatural quiet settled over the room, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I was caught in a relentless grip of fear that refused to let me go, and I knew I was no longer safe in my own home. 2 weeks earlier, a colleague of mine, someone I'd known for a few years through work functions, approached me with a peculiar gift. He had told me that he picked up a small wooden bust at some antique bazaar and that he couldn't bear to look at it anymore. He claimed it was giving him nightmares, though he didn't elaborate. Since I have a soft spot for strange collectibles and oddities, I agreed to take it off his hands. In truth, I found the figure unusual, but not particularly menacing at the time. Just a carved female bust with dark lines etched into the wood, the features slightly exaggerated. My colleague all but shoved the thing into my arms, muttering something about how his own living space felt heavier with it around. I hadn't thought much of his ominous tone then. I assumed he was just being dramatic, or that maybe he was dealing with stress unrelated to the statue. I placed the figurine on the top shelf of my living room, surrounded by old books and a few other souvenirs from my travels. For a while, it blended into the background, just another decorative curiosity that I barely glanced at while I went about my daily routine. My job as a systems analyst demanded long hours, so by the time I arrived home most nights, all I wanted to do was collapse onto the couch or my bed. The small wooden bust was simply part of the room's decor, no more noticeable than the lamp in the corner or the painting above the sofa. But strange things began happening, little details that I first attributed to my own carelessness or exhaustion. On some mornings, I noticed that the bust was slightly off-center, as though it had been nudged. I rationalized that I must have knocked it while I was reaching for a book. A few days later, I thought I saw it tilted to the left. Just a subtle difference in angle, but enough to catch my eye. Again, I convinced myself it was all in my head. After all, Living alone, I couldn't exactly blame someone else for messing with my belongings, and objects sometimes shift if the surface they rest on isn't perfectly level. As the days passed, the uneasiness expanded. I started catching myself glancing over at the bust every few minutes. Whenever I returned from work, I felt a pressing need to check on it, to confirm that it hadn't moved. I would examine its position, carefully noting the exact angle at which its head was facing, the direction of its gaze. Each time I looked, my heart pounded with an inexplicable tension, and my mouth went dry. My rational mind insisted that nothing was amiss, yet my body registered fear in the form of sweaty palms and a mounting tightness in my chest. One night, I came home later than usual, stepping into the house with the weight of an exhausting day draped across my shoulders. I flicked on the living room light and nearly dropped my briefcase when I saw the bust on the windowsill, facing the darkness outside. My mind raced to recall if I had moved it earlier. I was certain I hadn't. The idea of someone breaking into the house to rearrange an antique figurine struck me as absurd. Still, it made no sense for it to be anywhere but the shelf. My whole body erupted in a cold sweat as I realized something was very wrong. Fighting against the crescendo of panic rising inside me, I crossed the room and picked it up. The wood felt strangely colder than the surrounding air, as if it had been chilling somewhere far below normal room temperature. My heartbeat hammered against my ribcage as I carried it back to the shelf and placed it there, this time leaning a book against it to ensure it stayed put. Yet my attempts at controlling the situation gave me no sense of safety. Every time I looked at the figurine, I was filled with an unshakable conviction that it was aware of my presence. The very notion of such a thing frightened me enough to leave the room, but even then, I could feel its carved features in my mind, the hollows of its carved eyes seeming to bore into my thoughts. That night, I barely slept. My head was filled with dread-laden imaginings, and I woke multiple times to check the living room, half expecting to find the figure gone from its place again. When I confided in a friend the next day, speaking mostly in vague terms, he told me I sounded paranoid, maybe overworked, and I agreed, at least on the surface. In my heart, however, I knew my experiences were too tangible to dismiss outright. He suggested I keep it in a box or lock it away if it really disturbed me that much. It seemed like a simple enough solution, and I was desperate for anything that might restore my sense of peace. So that very evening, I placed the bust into a small wooden chest I kept in a closet. I sealed it shut and set it on the top shelf in the hallway, trying to avoid looking at it for too long. Just seeing it in my hands made my breath catch in my throat, as though the figurine exuded a palpable aura of unease. For a few days, I convinced myself that everything was back to normal. I left early for work and returned late, always hurrying past the closet without so much as a glance. Yet the sense of being watched never fully disappeared. It was like a persistent itch in the back of my mind, an awareness that something was waiting for me. At night in my bedroom, I heard soft noises from somewhere in the house. Nothing overt or dramatic, just a faint creaking sound as though floorboards were under pressure. Each time, I'd hold my breath, feeling the accelerated thump of my heartbeat, telling myself it was just the house settling. But it always felt like something else, something alive. My lungs would tighten, and I'd notice a sheen of sweat forming on my arms and forehead. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. Late one evening, when the silence in the house felt almost suffocating, I found myself drawn to the closet door. My heart pounded like a drum, reverberating through my entire torso, and I could feel my pulse quickening. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the door, reached up for the box, and carefully brought it down. The moment my fingertips made contact with the chest, an electric shock of dread swept through me, like my body was trying to warn me of imminent danger. The wood felt colder than it had any right to be. I paused, leaning against the wall and taking a few deep, shuddering breaths. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a swath of old cloth, was the figurine. Its face seemed different from how I remembered. Maybe the shadows from the overhead light cast its features in a more sinister contour, or perhaps my paranoia was distorting it. Even so, I couldn't shake the impression that its carved expression had shifted. Where before it seemed neutral, Now it appeared subtly contorted, as if in a silent snarl or grin. My body responded in a violent wave of goosebumps, and I felt a drop of sweat slide down the back of my neck. I quickly shut the lid and shoved the chest back on the shelf. It took every ounce of willpower to walk away. In the following days, the sense of dread amplified. The atmosphere in the house became oppressive, and I couldn't go from one room to another without feeling an inexplicable surge of anxiety. Whenever I neared the closet, I felt something akin to a static charge in the air, a silent hum of tension that set my nerves on edge. I reached a point where I could barely concentrate on anything else. My performance at work suffered, and I found myself avoiding social invitations because I was anxious about returning home late or leaving the house for too long. I was spiraling into a constant state of unrest, never truly at ease. My nights became nightmares of half-sleep and chilling visions. In the darkness, I would imagine hearing the soft scraping of wood against the wall, or the distinct sound of the chest lid creaking open on its hinges. My heart would race, and my breath would catch in my throat as I strained my ears. There were times I could have sworn I heard faint footsteps on the hallway floor, unhurried and deliberate. I'd lie there in bed, hands clammy, chest tight, as the minutes stretched into agonizing hours. Sometimes I would become so terrified that my body seized up, unable to move despite my mind screaming for me to act. By morning, I was always drenched in sweat, exhausted and on edge, my eyes sunken from the relentless insomnia. On a particularly suffocating night, I decided I could endure the tension no longer. I needed to do something, anything, to free myself from the figurine's hold. I considered returning it to my colleague, but the very notion of holding it in my car for the drive made me break into a nervous sweat. I thought about discarding it somewhere far away, but that idea also felt disturbingly reckless. What if it found its way back somehow? The thought seemed irrational, yet my mind clung to it with a grotesque certainty. Eventually, I resolved to confront it directly, to look upon the bust under bright, unflinching light, and see if I could demystify it. On a Saturday afternoon, when sunshine streamed through my windows, I pulled the chest out and set it on the living room table. I took a moment to steady my hands, breathing slowly in an attempt to ward off the prickly dread tightening my stomach. Opening the lid, I removed the figurine and placed it on the table. I studied every curve of the carving, every groove in the wood. It was about the length of my hand, with intricately etched details around the eyes and mouth. The hair seemed intentionally styled into swirling patterns, and the carved eyes seemed to have minute circles within them, like concentric rings that drew me in the longer I looked. As the daylight touched its surface, I noticed something peculiar about the wood. It had dark patches that seemed to glisten in the sunlight, almost as though they were tiny pockets of moisture. Yet the bust felt dry to the touch. I ran my fingertips over its surface, each pass making my skin prickle as though the wood emitted a faint vibration. My pulse thumped wildly, and my breath caught in my throat again. There was nothing overtly dangerous about this object, and yet it radiated a presence that made every instinct in my body scream for me to stop touching it. All of a sudden, I felt an acute sense of vertigo. The room around me seemed to distort, the corners stretching and contracting in my peripheral vision. My chest tightened painfully, as though I was being squeezed by an invisible force. I stumbled back, gasping for air, and dropped onto the couch. My heartbeat slammed so hard it felt like it would burst out of my ribcage, and my vision blurred with spots of black and white. In that moment, I lost all sense of time. I couldn't tell if it lasted seconds or minutes. The only thing I was aware of was a suffocating panic that overwhelmed my entire being. The wooden bust sat there on the table, silent and unmoving, yet exuding a horrifying energy that battered my senses. When the wave of disorientation passed, I realized I was drenched in sweat, as though I'd just run a marathon. My limbs felt shaky and weak, and my breathing was ragged. I forced myself upright, eyes locked on the figurine. There was an unspoken certainty in my mind that it was somehow feeding off my fear, twisting my perception and plunging me deeper into paranoia. My rational self insisted it was just an inanimate object, but every fiber of my being rejected that explanation. I couldn't trust the normal laws of reality anymore. The bust's mere presence disrupted my ability to think straight. With trembling hands, I retrieved a small cardboard box from my closet and set it on the table. I packed the figurine inside, stuffing the empty spaces with old newspapers. Then I taped it shut, wrapping the box in multiple layers just to be sure it stayed sealed. I could hardly stand to look at the box once it was done. Even so, I could still sense its presence, as though the figurine's malignant aura bled through the layers of cardboard and tape. My skin crawled at the thought, but at least I no longer had to look at its carved features. Now, the box remains in my hallway closet, locked behind a small padlock that I purchased specifically for this. But every time I pass by, the air turns frigid, and a chill creeps over my skin, causing the hairs on my arms to stand on end. It's as if my body instinctively recognizes that the worst threat I've ever known lies mere feet away behind a thin wooden door. My nights are still fraught with anxiety, but they are marginally more bearable since I no longer keep the object in plain sight. Sometimes I still hear subtle knocks or shifting sounds that seem to come from the closet. I try to dismiss them as household noises or tricks of the mind, but in my heart, I can't ignore the possibility that something beyond my understanding is seeking release. I keep telling myself that I should find a way to get rid of it once and for all. Burn it, maybe, or bury it in a remote place. But I'm plagued by visions of the figurine turning up again, on my windowsill, on my kitchen counter, or perched near my bed. A disturbing part of me even wonders if destroying it might unleash something far worse. So, for now, I choose the lesser evil of keeping it locked away. At times, I manage to distract myself with work or mundane responsibilities. Yet there's always that lingering sense of dread deep in my gut, reminding me that the figurine remains in my possession. I have no neat resolution or comforting finale to offer. The closest I've come to any kind of revelation is this unnerving awareness that fear itself can manifest in ways we never anticipated, ways that warp our senses, pollute our dreams, and threaten our sanity. I exist in a state of fragile detente with the figurine, hoping that my vigilance will keep the horrors it inspires at bay. But even as I write these words, a prickling apprehension settles over me, the quiet whisper that it wants to be found, that perhaps it wants to be seen again. And that, above all, is what terrifies me most. The notion that this eerie effigy, with its sinister aura and impossible behavior, is far from finished with me. I can only pray that my makeshift containment is enough to keep whatever dwells within that cursed wood at bay. Still, I feel its stare through the layers of tape, cardboard, and darkness. Sometimes I wonder how long I can continue this uneasy coexistence before it finds a way to break free, or before my own mind succumbs to the gnawing terror I've tried so desperately to bury. I felt the change in the air the moment I stepped into that guest room, like the atmosphere itself was recoiling at my presence. It was a subtle shift at first, a faint pressure on my chest that made me inhale just a little sharper, and exhale with a tremor. I tried to brush it off as my imagination. After all, I lived alone, and that small, seldom-used room was merely a place to store suitcases or extra blankets. Yet I couldn't deny that something felt wrong in there. The walls seemed too close, the light too dim, even when the bulb was brand new, and a bizarre weight pressed down on me as if the very air wanted to squeeze the breath out of my lungs. I told myself I was overreacting. I tried to laugh it off, but the discomfort clung to me, following me out into the hallway and lingering long after I closed the door. I should explain that I've been the sole occupant of this apartment for years, an arrangement I normally love. The quiet suits me. After a long day at work, I enjoy coming back to a serene space where I can decompress. However, that guest room was never part of the calming routine. It existed more as a necessary formality, a place to stash occasional visitors or store belongings that didn't quite fit anywhere else. The older I got, the fewer guests I received. So it sat, essentially abandoned, with the door shut for months at a time. Once every few weeks, I would need to step in there for something. A winter coat in a plastic bin, maybe, or a piece of luggage. Each time, the claustrophobic tension in my chest grew more insistent. This sense of dread took a major turn a couple of weeks ago. The room's overhead light had burned out, so I stopped by the hardware store to grab a fresh bulb. I twisted the doorknob that evening, new bulb in one hand and a stool in the other. The second I entered, the hairs on the back of my neck rose. It was as if I had just walked into a funeral parlor, thick with an uncomfortable stillness. The air smelled stale, tinged with an odd hint of something metallic. I flipped the switch out of habit, forgetting that the bulb was dead, and darkness swallowed me. For a moment, my heart pounded so loudly I thought my eardrums would burst. Breathing became a struggle. When I managed to fumble for the lamp on the nightstand, I discovered something that jolted me more than the darkness ever could. The bed, which was always pushed flush against the wall, had been moved a few inches forward. There was a distinct gap now, enough space to slip a hand behind the headboard. I paused, the new bulb clutched so tightly in my palm I was afraid I'd shatter it. I live alone, and no one else had been in this apartment for months. It made no sense. My mind began spinning with possible explanations. Maybe I had knocked into it last time I was here. Maybe I'd moved it myself, although I was absolutely certain I had not. The door had been locked, as always, yet the bed was undeniably out of place. I forced myself to dismiss the incident, deciding that I must have inadvertently pushed the bed away from the wall at some earlier point. After all, I wasn't in the habit of meticulously checking the distance between furniture and walls. So, I balanced on the stool, replaced the burnt-out bulb, and flicked the light back on. I felt almost silly breathing a sigh of relief once the room was illuminated in that weak yellowish glow. But the relief was short-lived. The sensation of being watched had grown stronger. Like an invisible set of eyes was trained on my every movement. My body responded with a cold sweat that pooled at the small of my back and dampened my shirt. My legs trembled so much I nearly missed a step getting off the stool. I left the room as quickly as I could, resisting the impulse to slam the door behind me. My skin prickled, as if expecting a hand on my shoulder at any moment. Yet when I was back in my living room, everything felt normal again. The dread evaporated, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. It was like stepping out of a thick fog into fresh, open air. I tried to reassure myself by going through the rational possibilities. My mind latched onto the idea that the wiring might be faulty, that perhaps the flickering or burning out of bulbs could create an oppressive atmosphere. It was a stretch, but I needed something logical. The next morning I called an electrician. The smell of coffee was comforting in my kitchen as I explained to him, through indirect details, that my guest room was acting strange, though I avoided sounding too paranoid. He arrived a couple of days later, poked around the sockets, switched the lights on and off, checked the breaker. Nothing. He said everything looked fine and suggested I might want to keep an eye on the humidity or ventilation in the room to avoid mold. That was it. He left without a second thought. If anything, the clean bill of health on the room's electrical system made me feel worse. Now there was no logical reason for the fear that gnawed at my insides. I considered that maybe I was losing my grip. Sleeplessness, stress at work. Maybe these were fueling irrational anxieties. Yet, each time I approached the guest room, that visceral feeling of dread surfaced like clockwork, stronger and more tangible than any stressful day at the office. I began hearing small noises in the night. It wasn't loud, just faint taps or the subtle shifting of furniture. On one occasion, I was certain I heard a muffled dragging sound, like a piece of wood scraping across the floor. The next morning, I checked the guest room. The bed was still out of place. I pushed it firmly back against the wall, making sure to press it as far as it would go. I left, closed the door, and stood there in the hallway, heart racing, trying to steady my breathing. An hour later, I forced myself to open the door again. The bed had moved forward by at least half an inch, leaving a fresh streak on the floor as if something had yanked it from behind. My throat went dry. I tried to swallow, but it felt like my body refused. I had never felt so thoroughly violated by my own home. I started to second-guess my memory. Was it possible I hadn't pushed the bed all the way back? Perhaps I misjudged where it started, but the evidence was right there on the floor, small scuffs that definitely weren't present before. Each time I discovered a new mark, it reinforced the idea that something was tampering with my surroundings. I avoided sleeping in my own bedroom for a couple of nights because I could feel the intangible weight pressing through the walls. Instead, I dozed off on the couch with the television on, hoping the glow of late-night programs would comfort me. Sleep was shallow. I'd drift off, then jolt awake after hearing an unexpected bump from the guest room. My heart hammered so violently that I'd break out in a cold sweat. The blanket tangled around my legs. Each time it happened, I debated whether to investigate or pretend I hadn't heard anything. Fear usually won, and I stayed away from the door, anxiety gnawing at my gut. Days passed, and I tried to carry on with life as normally as possible. I went to work, answered emails, forced small talk with coworkers, but I felt the strain in every conversation. People asked if I was sleeping all right, because I had begun sporting dark circles under my eyes and a tension in my shoulders that made me look perpetually on guard. I simply mumbled something about stress. The last thing I wanted was to invite someone over or inadvertently involve them in this madness. Still, a nagging idea lurked in the back of my mind. Maybe the guest room could be rented out. I had toyed with the notion before, especially because living alone can be expensive. But now, the idea wasn't driven by finances. Instead, it was fueled by a desperate hope that another person's presence would stabilize the atmosphere or confirm that I wasn't imagining it all. Yet, I hesitated. What if something truly sinister was happening in that room? It felt irresponsible to subject anyone else to it. And what would I even say? Just so you know, the bed has a habit of moving on its own, and the air feels like it wants to choke you. But the rent's reasonable. One night, the tension became too overwhelming to ignore. I decided to confront the room directly. I told myself, somewhat sarcastically, that I was going to spend a few hours in there, read a book, and prove to my skittish brain that nothing was amiss. So, armed with a novel, a cup of tea, and a determination I wasn't sure I truly felt, I opened the door. Instantly, I regretted it. The staleness of the air was even more apparent, and I had the uncanny impression that something was waiting for me, like stepping into a cage with a predator crouched in the corner. My heart rate spiked to a thundering tempo, and sweat beaded on my forehead. I forced myself to sit on the bed. The mattress felt colder than I remembered, almost damp. My skin prickled with goosebumps that had nothing to do with temperature. I tried to ignore the dread, open the book, and let my eyes skim the words without processing them. A few minutes in, the overhead light flickered. Just once. My breath caught in my throat. The electrician said everything was fine, I reminded myself. But that flicker triggered a wave of nausea in me. I felt unsteady, like the floor beneath me might shift. I don't know how long I sat there pretending to read. My chest felt tighter with each passing second. My palms became clammy against the book's cover. I became uncomfortably aware of my own pulse thrumming in my ears. My eyes darted around the room, expecting movement in the corners. The shadows seemed to shift whenever I looked away, and the gloom in the corners felt darker than it should, considering the light overhead. It was as if I was experiencing a glitch in reality, seeing a subtle distortion that made the walls ripple. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. My nerves were shredded. I tossed the book aside and hurried into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. My vision swam with panic, and I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. By the time I caught my breath, I felt a searing headache building behind my temples, the tension physically manifesting. That night, I returned to my couch, hoping for a few restless hours of sleep. Instead, I was jolted awake by what sounded like 3 distinct knocks from inside the guest room. My lungs seized up, and for a split second I couldn't move. Every beat of my heart pounded in my throat. With shaking hands, I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and forced myself to stand. The hallway felt as if it had grown narrower. Step by step, I approached the closed door, my stomach twisting in knots. The knocking had stopped. My ears rang in the silence. I placed my hand on the doorknob, noticing how slick my palm had become with sweat. I didn't open it. Instead, I pressed my ear to the surface, straining to hear. The wood felt cold against the side of my face. For a moment, I thought I heard a gentle rustling sound, but it could have been the blood surging through my own ears. My entire body shook, and I stepped back. I realized I was too terrified to go inside. A wave of shame and frustration washed over me. This was my home, yet I was too scared to open a door. Finally, I retreated to the living room, the flashlight beam trembling over the floor. Over the next few days, a series of small but nerve-wracking events occurred. Lights in other parts of the apartment began flickering momentarily, but always resumed normal function. Odd spots of cold air appeared in the hallway, making my breath hitch as though I were stepping into a freezer. Once I walked into the bathroom and saw that the mirror was fogged, as if someone had taken a hot shower, but the room was bone dry and the day was sweltering. More than once I caught a fleeting glimpse of motion at the edge of my vision, a dark shape in the peripheral that vanished when I turned my head. Whether these were tricks of anxiety or genuine phenomena, I couldn't say. Either way, my sanity was teetering on the edge. I began to question if I should seek professional help, a therapist or even a spiritual advisor of some sort. But I hesitated, unsure how to explain the bizarre occurrences without sounding unhinged. Rationally, I wanted it all to be the result of my overactive imagination. Yet the tangible evidence, the scuff marks on the floor, the shifting furniture, the oppressive atmosphere, kept telling me something else was at play. Eventually, I hit a breaking point. I decided to face the room one final time and record whatever happened. I thought that if I captured something on camera, I would have proof, either to show a friend or to confirm that I needed serious help. So, one evening, I mounted my phone on a tripod in the corner of the guest room, aimed it at the bed, and left the light on. I pressed record and stepped out, shutting the door behind me. My plan was to leave it running for an hour, then review the footage. If nothing happened, maybe I would be able to calm down. If something did happen, at least I'd have answers. That hour felt endless. I tried to distract myself by organizing the kitchen cabinets, but every tick of the clock made my stomach clench tighter. When the time was up, I retrieved the phone, heart hammering so fiercely it felt like it might break free from my chest. I went to the living room, set the phone on the coffee table, and prepared myself to watch. The first few minutes were uneventful. The bed remained still, the overhead light steady. 10 minutes in, I noticed a flicker in the corner of the screen, like a tiny distortion, as if the video itself had a glitch. My palms started sweating. At around the 20-minute mark, the bed shifted. Not a dramatic lurch, but a slow, subtle scrape. It moved forward an inch or two, as though something behind it were pushing. My breath caught in my throat. No one was in the room, and the door was visibly closed. I watched in horror as the bed continued to inch forward, creating a small gap at the headboard. My heart pounded so hard that I could feel my pulse throbbing in my fingertips. Then, at minute 35, the light flickered once, twice, and the camera caught a faint shadow dart across the frame. No distinct shape or outline, just a vague darkness that swept from one corner to the other. When it passed, the lamp flickered again, then remained solid. I couldn't look away. The bed was now several inches from the wall, as if forcibly pulled. Tears welled in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer terror of realizing I wasn't imagining any of this. Something was in that room, and it wanted to make itself known. I stopped the footage, my hands trembling so severely that I nearly dropped the phone. A wave of nausea hit me, and I had to steady myself against the couch. Seeing the bed move on camera validated my worst fears. I half expected to feel some triumph at having proof, but all I felt was dread. There was no telling what might happen if I stayed in this apartment any longer. I made a decision then and there. I wasn't going to let this thing, or my fear of it, rule my life. I marched to the guest room door, phone still in hand, determined to confront whatever lurked inside. My heart threatened to explode out of my chest as I turned the knob. The door opened smoothly, silently. The bed was once again out of place, just as in the video. The overhead light buzzed faintly. My throat went dry, but I forced myself inside. The pressure was immediate and crushing, a suffocating heaviness that made my lungs burn. I felt every inch of my body tingle with static electricity, as though the air itself were electrified. My vision blurred for a moment, and I nearly collapsed from the weight on my chest. A frantic thought screamed at me to flee, but I set my jaw and refused to run. I pointed the phone's camera toward the bed, as if filming in real time might protect me somehow. That's when I noticed the door behind me inching closed, not slamming, but moving slowly, as though guided by an unseen hand. My pulse thundered in my ears. The door latched with a soft click, and the handle refused to budge when I tried to turn it. My breath came in ragged gasps. A frantic wave of panic threatened to send me into hysteria, but I wrestled it down and yanked the door again. It gave way, releasing me with a sudden jolt that caused me to stumble back into the hallway. I stood there, panting, drenched in sweat, heart pounding so violently I thought I might pass out. Then I shut the door, locked it, and marched to the living room where I collapsed onto the couch. My limbs felt like water, and I trembled uncontrollably. No part of me wanted to enter that room again. Whatever existed behind that door was beyond my understanding, an unseen presence that could manipulate objects, distort light, and assault my senses with crippling terror. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand what happened in that guest room. I've seriously considered moving out, though a part of me doesn't want to be driven away from my own home. On the other hand, I can't in good conscience invite someone else to live here. No one should endure that presence or witness those unsettling movements. For now, I keep the room locked and avoid it at all costs. The knowledge that it remains just down the hall gnaws at me, but I haven't heard the strange dragging sounds for a few nights now. Maybe it's dormant. Maybe it's waiting. Even as I write this, my hands are shaking. Every creak in the apartment makes me wonder if that thing is stirring, inching furniture, or distorting the electricity. My mind drifts back to the footage on my phone, the irrefutable evidence that something unnatural hides in those walls. Whatever it is, it doesn't want company, and I've chosen to respect that boundary. If there's a next step, I'm not sure what it might be. A priest? A medium? A therapist? All I know is that the sense of being watched hasn't vanished. It lingers in the back of my mind, whispering doubts and fueling paranoia. I catch myself staring at the guest room door, half convinced it might swing open on its own. So far, it hasn't. I can't say how this will end. There's no neat conclusion here, just an ever-present feeling that something sinister resides in my home, and I'm struggling to keep it contained. My reality has been twisted. I've questioned my sanity more times than I can count, but the evidence of my senses continues to confirm that I'm not delusional. For now, I'm left with a persistent unease whenever I walk down that hallway. The fear clutches at my chest, the memory of that oppressive atmosphere forever etched into my bones, and every so often, in the hush of night, I feel certain I hear a faint scraping sound, like the bed inching across the floor, reminding me that it's still there, waiting. I remember the first time I felt truly afraid in my own home. It was late evening, and a stagnant hush had settled over my property, so complete that even my own breathing sounded jarringly loud. As I aimed my flashlight across the backyard, I saw something tall and dark slide past the far wall, and for a split second, my heart thundered in my chest so fiercely that it almost drowned out every other thought. That instant of panic left a deep mark on me, a sense that some boundary had been crossed. No one wants to feel unsafe in their own space. But after that night, my yard turned into a breeding ground for fear, and no matter how much I tried to brush off the unease as mere imagination, I could never shake the impression that something was out there, waiting. I've always enjoyed living on the outskirts of town. The house is a single-story structure with wide windows that let in abundant sunlight during the day. My backyard is vast, almost too large for just one person, and I've kept it full of greenery that I painstakingly care for. Over the years, I've grown comfortable with minimal streetlights, trusting my flashlight or the soft glow of my porch lamp whenever I needed to check on my plants after sunset. The air feels crisp here in the evenings, the stillness marred only by the occasional barking of a distant dog or the rustling of leaves. It used to be serene. Now I can't take 2 steps out there without my pulse going haywire. It began a few weeks ago. I stepped out to water my plants, the metal watering can in one hand and a small flashlight in the other. The day had been unusually hot, and I wanted to give my succulents a good soak before calling it a night. As I approached the far end of my yard, I noticed a flicker of movement against the back wall. At first, I thought it was nothing, perhaps a trick of the light. But then it shifted again, sliding along the wall in a manner too quick and too vertical to be a cat or some neighborhood critter. I raised my flashlight, expecting to see a stray animal, or at worst, an intruder. But the beam revealed only the unassuming bricks and the ivy that crawled along them. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to find some rational explanation. Maybe a shadow cast by a passing car's headlights, I told myself, even though traffic is scarce out here. Or perhaps an owl overhead, though I heard no flapping of wings. In those moments, I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my palms getting clammy around the handle of the watering can. The rest of the night was normal, in the sense that nothing else jumped out at me, yet I lay awake in bed later, replaying that scene endlessly. The feeling of being watched clung to me like a cold sweat. Over the next few nights, the strange sight repeated. I would go outside with my flashlight, and my eyes would catch a fleeting silhouette. Something too big to be a cat, too tall to be just my own shadow. Each time, I tried to pin down the source. I even walked the perimeter of my yard, shining the flashlight along every inch of the fence and wall, checking for anything that could distort the shadows. I examined the position of the few lampposts on the street, but none were angled in a way that explained that looming shape. My breath would become shallow, fear constricting my lungs, and I could feel the racing throb of blood in my ears. It felt like I was being toyed with, teased by a presence just beyond my ability to perceive it clearly. I started watering my plants earlier to avoid the darkness altogether, but that only helped so much, because the feeling began to haunt me even in daylight. I remember standing in the kitchen, preparing coffee one afternoon, when I could have sworn I saw a flash of black movement outside my window. I turned so fast I nearly dropped the cup. Nothing, just the wind brushing the leaves of my smaller shrubs. Yet the rush of adrenaline I felt was real. My palms got damp with sweat. My heart started its frantic race again, and the dryness in my mouth made me gulp for air as though I'd been running. Eventually, my nerves got the better of me, and I decided I needed a second opinion, someone to reassure me that I was imagining things. A coworker of mine, who lived not too far away, stopped by one weekend. He casually asked why I'd been looking tired lately, and I told him I was having trouble sleeping, that I felt uneasy around my backyard. He suggested we do a quick walk outside at dusk to prove nothing was there. We stepped onto the grass as the sky faded into a pale orange. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the flickers of movement. He said maybe it was just a large raccoon or an overgrown coyote, though he admitted it would be unusual to see one looming upright against the wall. The sun dipped lower, and I could feel my pulse in my temples. We walked the perimeter again, my coworker shining a brighter flashlight than mine on every corner, every cluster of leaves, every suspicious crevice. We found nothing. We returned inside, and he joked that I might just need more rest. I forced a laugh, but deep down I felt no relief. I'd half expected not to find anything, and my coworker's reassurances only underscored how irrational I might appear. The moment he left, I was alone again, left to question whether something real lurked outside or if my mind was turning against me. That night I tried to distract myself by reading, but I caught myself glancing through the window every few minutes. The yard outside was a pool of darkness. The faint glow from a single bulb near the porch revealed only the nearest plants. Beyond that gentle circle, everything was murky. I leaned closer to the window, straining my eyes to see if something moved. My breath fogged up the glass, and for an instant, I saw what looked like a tall shape near the fence, blacker than the surrounding shadows. I froze, my body suddenly rigid, the hair on my arms and neck standing on end. My stomach churned with a wave of nausea, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. When I wiped the condensation from the glass for a clearer view, the shape was gone. Yet the dread remained, drilling into my chest, making my heart pound so fiercely I could hear it echo in the silent room. The next day, I decided to install a motion sensor light in the backyard. I told myself it was purely for peace of mind. If something was indeed moving around back there, I wanted to catch it in a flood of sudden brightness. The task itself wasn't difficult, but I found my hands shaking as I climbed the ladder to secure the light. My mouth felt dry, my muscles tense. Every rustle of the grass seemed magnified, making me stop and survey the yard more often than necessary. Finally, I got the sensor working, tested it by walking around. The instant I passed in front of its beam, the entire back portion of the yard lit up. Satisfied, I went to bed that night hoping the bright glare would reveal any intruder, or confirm my paranoia once and for all. But hope quickly dissolved into dread. The sensor light became a silent alarm system that kept flicking on when I was nowhere near the yard. I'd be in the kitchen late in the evening, and suddenly the window would flare with white light. My chest would seize up in panic as I stepped to the window, only to see the yard empty, yet the sensor had detected movement. More than once, the light turned on and off sporadically 3 or 4 times in a single night. Each time, I'd feel the breath catch in my throat, my heartbeat thudding so heavily I half expected it to burst. One evening, I forced myself to step outside when the light activated. My entire body was shaking from head to toe, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back despite the coolness of the night air. I circled the yard slowly, shining my flashlight around, half hoping to catch a wild animal, or even a stray cat triggering the sensor. But there was nothing, only the faint hum of the bulb above, and my own ragged breathing breaking the silence. Over time, a suffocating sense of paranoia began to gnaw at me. During the day, I found myself jumping at small noises, flinching at any flicker of a shadow. When night fell, the mere act of switching off the indoor lights became an ordeal, because it left the windows black and reflective, turning them into mirrors that taunted me with the possibility that something could be outside, peering back. I started drawing the curtains tightly, thinking if I couldn't see out, then I wouldn't conjure more illusions. But the feeling of eyes on me persisted. In the shower, I'd find my heart beating too fast, imagining I heard footsteps in the hallway. When I ate dinner alone in my small dining area, the quiet felt immense, pressing on me from all sides. I woke up one night in a cold sweat, convinced I had heard a scraping noise on the exterior wall near my bedroom. My pulse was out of control, and I realized I could taste the metallic tang of fear at the back of my throat. I stayed in bed, breath held, listening intently. The house was silent aside from the usual creaks that accompany the shift of temperature. I told myself it was probably just the wind brushing a branch against the siding. But the next morning, when I checked the wall, I noticed faint marks that I couldn't remember seeing before. Thin scratches that ran parallel for a few inches. They could have been there for years, I reasoned. But now every unusual detail felt like a fresh clue pointing to something menacing. By this point, I'd started to question my own sanity. It was logical to assume I was overworked, perhaps suffering from lack of proper rest. The tension and stress could explain the paranoia, the hyper-alertness, but logical thinking gave me little comfort at night. I began to wonder if whatever I was seeing, or thought I was seeing, was not a physical intruder but something else entirely. The idea that I might be dealing with something beyond a trespasser made my skin crawl. I tried to dismiss the notion as pure fancy, but each unexplained moment bolstered the possibility that I was no longer in control of my environment or even my own perceptions. One night, the motion sensor light woke me again. It flooded my room with a harsh glare because the windows were uncovered, a lapse in my nightly ritual. My heart slammed in my ribcage like a warning siren, and I forced myself to get out of bed. I moved toward the window on trembling legs, my throat tight, dryness making each swallow feel painful. Through the glass, I saw the backyard illuminated in stark whiteness, and there, standing near the far corner of the fence, was a shape. It was tall, much taller than me, and it had a faint outline that almost seemed to ripple, as though it wasn't fully solid. My breath hitched as I stared, certain this time my eyes weren't deceiving me. 1,000 thoughts flashed through my head. Should I call the police? Should I turn on every light in the house? Should I hide? Before I could decide on anything, the shape shifted out of the illuminated area, swallowed by the darkness. My body almost collapsed from tension. It took all my willpower just to steady my breathing and not collapse on the spot. I flicked on every light in the house and sat in my living room, hugging my knees, forcing myself to focus on the mundane details of my surroundings. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, anything to remind me I was still in the real world. But a part of me felt like I was slipping into a nightmare that refused to let go. In the following days, I resolved to confront this presence somehow. Living in constant fear had become unbearable. My appetite was gone, my eyes stung from lack of sleep, and my nerves were frayed to the point that any unexpected noise made me jerk violently. One late afternoon, as dusk began to settle, I stood in my backyard with a bright flashlight in hand. My palms were so sweaty that I had to wipe them repeatedly on my jeans. My heartbeat was a quick staccato, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I told myself that if I saw the shadow again, I would approach it. No more running inside. No more letting fear dictate my actions. I stood there for what felt like hours, scanning the perimeter of my property, waiting. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the yard fell into deepening shades of gray. My throat felt parched and my chest tightened with every minute that passed. The sensor light remained still. My flashlight beam trailed along the fence, up the walls, across the line of potted plants. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and a timid breeze. But just when I was about to tell myself nothing would happen tonight, the motion sensor light blazed on, revealing the far corner. And there it was again, that tall, impossible silhouette, distinctly separate from any object or plant. My heart slammed so hard I thought I might faint, but I forced my legs to move, stepping forward. The presence seemed to shudder, as though it couldn't maintain its form under direct scrutiny. My breath came out in ragged bursts, and my muscles quivered with each slow step. I felt a primal urge to turn and sprint, to hide inside the house and lock the door. But I pressed on, 5 steps, then 6, until I was within a few yards of that spot. Suddenly the light went out, plunging me into near total darkness. I stood there trembling, feeling the goosebumps ripple across my arms and the back of my neck. I fumbled with the flashlight switch, but the beam refused to cut through the oppressive darkness beyond a few feet. Then, I sensed it. Something very close. A shift of air, a faint whisper of movement to my left. My mouth went dry, my heart an erratic drumbeat. I turned the flashlight that way, and I swear I saw a brief glimpse of the tall figure leaning forward, as if curious about me. It wasn't human, at least not in any sense that I understood. Its outline was vaguely humanoid, yet it flickered and distorted like a shadow fighting to maintain shape. A low hum filled my ears, or perhaps it was just the blood rushing in my head. In that electrifying moment, I realized I was cornered in my own yard, face to face with the very thing I'd been dreading. I clutched the flashlight tighter, reminding myself not to shut my eyes, not to surrender to panic. I must have stood there for 10 seconds, locked in a silent standoff, every muscle tensed to the breaking point, sweat coursing down my back. Then a bizarre sensation rippled through me, like cold electricity washing over my skin. My flashlight flickered, and by the time it steadied, the shape was gone. The backyard felt empty, devoid of anything but my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on my couch, replaying the confrontation in my mind. I felt no triumph in facing it. I felt only a deep, throbbing unease. Whatever it was, it hadn't harmed me. It had simply observed, as if deciding how to respond. Even recalling the memory, my heart clenches, and my breath starts to hitch again. I've since taken a temporary leave from work. I've told people I'm dealing with personal issues, which isn't exactly a lie. The house feels different now, as though it has absorbed my anxiety into its walls. Every time I step outside, I'm bombarded by memories of that flickering silhouette. I still catch glimpses of movement near the back fence, But I no longer water my plants at night. In fact, I avoid going out there at all after sundown. The presence remains subtle, an ever-watchful thing at the edge of my vision, reminding me that I'm never truly alone. Yet I refuse to move. Perhaps I'm clinging to the idea that this is still my home, and I won't be chased away by fear. Or maybe I'm too shaken to face the prospect of relocating, of uprooting my life. Regardless, each night as I draw the curtains, I feel that cold prickle along my spine, and I know it's out there, waiting for me to slip. I question my own sanity sometimes, wonder if I'm gradually unraveling. But each time the sensor light bursts on by itself, each time I feel that intangible shift of air on the back of my neck, I'm reminded that my fear isn't baseless. I haven't seen the figure in full clarity again, but I sense it. Even now, I can sense it. There's a corner in my yard that remains in shadow no matter how many bulbs I install or how diligently I keep things trimmed. When I look in that direction, the hairs on my arms stand up, and it's as if something looks back at me, curious, silent, and profoundly unsettling. Sometimes late at night, I hear a faint scraping near the back wall, like a reluctant visitor trying to remind me of its presence. It never becomes a direct threat, but it's a threat all the same, an unspoken reminder that the barrier between me and it is thin. I suspect that in time, either I will learn to coexist with this thing, or I will leave altogether. The tension in my chest has not relaxed since that first sighting. I feel it constantly, a knot of anxiety coiled behind my ribs. Even now, writing this, my palms sweat at the recollection, and my breath grows shallow. The final lingering question that haunts me is whether this entity is external, some supernatural intruder, or an extension of my own unraveling mind. Either possibility brings its own unique terror. For now, I remain here, with my overgrown yard and my nightly visits of tension. I still glance out the windows more often than I care to admit, half hoping to see something, half hoping it remains hidden. But every so often, my peripheral vision will catch a shift in the darkness, and a chill will crawl up my spine. I have no proof of what it is, only a gnawing certainty that it's real enough to keep me from feeling safe. And when people ask how I'm doing, I just offer a strained smile and say I'm getting by, because even if I manage to outrun my thoughts, I can never escape that tall, silent watcher in the backyard. The truth is, I may never truly be alone again. That night felt like the air itself had turned against me, thick, oppressive, and strangely charged, as though some invisible force pressed down on my shoulders. I could barely breathe. It was as if the darkness outside my window had seeped in through the walls and was pooling around my feet. In hindsight, I should have recognized that electric tension for what it was, a warning. But at the time, I simply told myself I was anxious from lack of sleep. After all, I had been suffering from those bizarre nightmares ever since I brought that strange painting into my home. I remember the day I bought it. I was at a local art fair, idly browsing one stall after another, never really intending to purchase anything substantial. But then I saw this eerie nighttime landscape. A calm lake reflecting a crescent moon, and a small house perched near the shore, illuminated by the faintest glow from a single window. The rest of the structure was shrouded in darkness. The moonlight barely revealed the outlines of trees behind it, and the water looked as cold as polished obsidian. I was struck by the craftsmanship. Something about the brushstrokes felt uncomfortably real. Even the quiet gloom it depicted seemed tangible, as though if I peered at it long enough, my vision might tunnel into that other place, crossing some threshold between my world and whatever world the artist had captured. The artist stood next to me, a tall, wiry man with tired eyes. He told me he had painted the scene from recurring dreams that haunted him. He claimed that each time he tried to capture every detail, but the dream always changed slightly. He seemed relieved to finally sell it off, remarking that he hoped it would bring me insight or perhaps resolution. The choice of words felt strange, but at the time I interpreted his statement as an eccentric sales pitch. I had no reason to doubt him, nor any inkling of the torment that would follow. I hung the painting in my living room against a wall that caught just enough natural light during the day to display the artwork. In the evenings, my lamps gave the canvas a soft glow, almost like moonlight. The first night I slept fine, but on the second, I found myself visiting that house in a dream, the same one from the painting. It looked identical, a lonely cabin with one lit window near a silent lake. The difference was, in my dream, I could sense movement inside. It was as though someone, or something, passed in front of that light, making the interior flicker. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just the power of suggestion. Yet every time I tried to fall back asleep, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me, like I was no longer alone in my own bedroom. By the third night, my dreams of the house became vivid. I could swear I smelled the dampness of the lake and felt the chilly breeze drifting through tall grass. The silence around that place was so profound, it hummed in my ears. Then something would stir in the shadows behind me. I never got a clear look at it. I only sensed a presence there, watching me from beneath a veil of trees. A subtle movement of the air, a slight rustle of leaves. My skin prickled in the dream just as it did in real life when I woke up. I had no idea what was happening to me, but each morning I noticed a dull ache in my muscles, like I'd spent the entire night restless and rigid. On the fourth evening, a friend dropped by unannounced. He had seen the painting at the art fair before I purchased it and complimented me on my choice, calling it haunting but mesmerizing. That night, however, he looked at the painting with an odd frown. He said something along the lines of it seeming different from how he remembered. I assumed maybe the lighting in my living room gave it a new appearance, but he specifically remarked that the house looked a bit bigger now, more central in the frame. I brushed him off politely, attributing his observation to overactive imagination or a trick of memory. Still, once he left, I couldn't resist checking the painting closely. The idea that it had changed without me noticing made my scalp tingle. I swore it was the same size as before, though I admit I felt foolish for measuring the proportions of a painted house with my eyes. I decided to go to bed early that night, determined to sleep soundly and dispel these creeping notions. Yet the moment I shut off the lights, I felt an unsettling hush descend upon the apartment, a hush that seemed to center around the living room. My cat, who usually loved her spot on the couch, refused to enter that room at all. She stayed in the hallway, fur bristling, eyes fixed on the painting as if expecting it to move. I tried coaxing her inside, but she wouldn't budge. Instead, she growled in a low, guttural rumble I had never heard from her before. It was a primal sound of warning. My arms broke out in goosebumps. Eventually, I gave up and went to bed, leaving my cat guarding the threshold. The nightmares returned, stronger than ever. This time, I wasn't just watching the cabin from a distance, I was compelled to approach its door. In the dream, my heart slammed against my ribcage, and cold sweat dripped down my temples. I heard my own breath ragged in my ears. Yet I kept moving closer, curiosity overriding my fear. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. A rotten stench emanated from the porch. The boards creaked under my footsteps, and a soft light flickered through the window. I never gathered enough courage to open the door. Instead, I stood there paralyzed, while the sound of something shifting inside made my stomach twist. My mouth was dry and my throat burned with every shallow intake of breath. I wanted to scream but couldn't. When I woke, I had to gasp for air, convinced I smelled damp earth and rotted wood in my bedroom. That morning, I couldn't even look at the painting without a surge of anxiety. An almost tangible dread radiated from it, as if the canvas itself emitted some dark energy. My cat, still unsettled, hissed when she passed by the living room entrance. She wouldn't set a single paw on the rug in front of that wall. I noticed, too, that the painting seemed more vivid. The shadows around the trees, the reflection of the moon on the water, everything looked sharper, more pronounced. With trembling hands, I leaned in, scouring every detail. The house certainly appeared more substantial than I remembered, as though it had inched closer within its own landscape. Or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The strangest part was the growing sense of being observed. Whether in my kitchen, the hallway, or my bedroom, I constantly felt the prickling weight of an unseen gaze. It was worst in the living room, right near the painting, where the atmosphere felt denser, almost suffocating. I tried to convince myself that it was all psychosomatic. But every time I entered that room, my breath grew tight, and a bead of cold sweat trickled down my spine. One night, a sudden noise jolted me from the verge of sleep. It sounded like a low moan, reverberating in the apartment walls, so faint I wasn't even sure I had truly heard it. But my heart hammered, as if I had. My cat hissed at the darkness, refusing to budge from my bedroom door. I flicked the lights on and scanned the living room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the painting caught my eye. The single window in the cabin was now a bit brighter than I remembered, as though the source of illumination inside had intensified. I stood there, sweat sticking my shirt to my back, forcibly reminding myself that paintings cannot just alter on their own. The next morning I spoke with a colleague about how I hadn't slept well in days. I described the painting in a vague way, not wanting to seem unhinged by accusing it of shape-shifting. He suggested that I might be under stress or dealing with unresolved anxieties. That explanation made sense on the surface, but it did nothing to dispel the foreboding aura swirling through my apartment. Over the following days, small, disconcerting occurrences piled up. I found muddy footprints near the back door of my apartment building. My cat's water bowl was inexplicably knocked over more than once when she was nowhere near it. The temperature in my living room felt perpetually cooler than the rest of the apartment, even though the thermostat was set to a uniform level. And, of course, the nightmares continued. My visits to the house by the lake grew bolder, or perhaps the entity within them grew bolder toward me. I felt compelled to step off the porch and walk around the back of the structure. The moonlight there seemed weak and filtered. An oppressive gloom clung to the walls. I could sense a presence just beyond my field of vision, an outline in the darkness that moved with impossible silence. Each time, I woke abruptly, heart thundering, skin clammy with fear. A part of me wanted to get rid of the painting immediately. I even picked it up off the wall once, but the moment I touched its frame, a nauseating dizziness crept into my head. My stomach flipped, and I had to support myself against the wall. I put the painting back, breathing rapidly, my pulse fluttering at my throat. The fear was so intense it felt as if the painting was resisting me, urging me to keep it where it was. I told myself I was imagining things, yet I couldn't deny the raw terror coursing through my veins. My cat, who had grown increasingly disturbed, began avoiding me altogether. She took to hiding under my bed during the day and venturing out only when I was asleep. Once so affectionate, she now looked at me with wide, wary eyes, as if I had become part of the danger. I started leaving the television or radio on when I was home, just to fill the silence that seemed to throb in the living room. But the static or music only made the emptiness more pronounced, a feeble barrier against the presence lurking just beyond my senses. The tension reached a breaking point on a Sunday evening. I'd spent most of the day trying to distract myself with errands and coffee shops, but dread gnawed at my stomach the entire time. By nightfall, I felt a magnetic pull toward the painting, an almost feverish need to examine it. My throat was dry, and a chill radiated from my core. I flipped on all the lamps in the living room, determined not to cower in darkness. The painting's details had indeed shifted. The trees on the left side had opened up, revealing a small path that I could have sworn wasn't there before. The house itself seemed to loom larger, dominating the center of the scene. And that single window was burning with a ghostly incandescence. As I stared, an inexplicable whisper skated across my ears. It might have been the wind outside, but it felt uncomfortably close to my face, as though someone stood right behind me, breathing shallowly. My heart kicked up its pace. I spun around, fists clenched, expecting to see an intruder. Nothing but empty air greeted me, and yet the sensation of being watched persisted. I wanted to scream just to break the tension. Instead, I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain still. At that moment, the overhead light flickered. My mouth went cotton dry, and I reached for the switch. The power surged back, but in that half-second darkness, I had the terrifying impression that the painted house wasn't just an image. It was an opening. I swear I glimpsed movement inside that window, a fleeting silhouette. It felt like something was on the other side, staring back. The lamplight stabilized, and the painting looked ordinary again, except for that haunting cold glow from the window. That was when I decided I couldn't endure another sleepless night, another round of nightmares. My only choice was to confront whatever was happening. I unhooked the painting from the wall. I felt dizzy again, but this time I gripped the frame tightly, teeth grinding, determined not to let fear get the better of me. I carried it to the center of the living room. The cat hissed from the hallway, refusing to come any closer. My body trembled. Sweat drenched my forehead. Even my vision felt shaky, as though I were teetering on the edge of a faint. I set the painting on a table and pulled a flashlight from a drawer. The overhead light still flickered occasionally, exacerbating my sense of doom. My breathing was shallow, each breath a ragged hiss through my clenched teeth. With the flashlight's beam, I inspected every inch of the canvas. The brushstrokes were intricate. The texture of the paint felt rough under my fingertips. But I sensed an odd vibration running through it. The hair on my arm stood on end. It was like a low-level hum, barely detectable, emanating from the painting itself. In my head, I tried to recall everything the artist had told me. He'd mentioned recurring dreams, an inability to fully capture them because they were always changing. I wondered if he had unleashed something by putting it on canvas, some creeping force that grew with each glance, feeding off my attention. It was as if the painting wanted to be noticed, needed to be studied, drawing me in just as the dream house drew me onto its porch. Fighting the wave of panic surging through me, I laid the painting face down. I stood there, waiting, as though expecting a reaction. The apartment was deathly quiet, except for my own pounding heartbeat. My chest felt tight, and a dizzy spell made me clutch the edge of the table for support. Then I heard a creak from the floorboards, an impossible sound, because I was standing on a tiled section of the living room. I jerked my head in the direction of the noise, pointing the flashlight like a weapon. My veins thrummed with adrenaline. Nothing was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had stepped into the room. For a split second, I considered fleeing my own home, but a strange resolve filled me. This was my space. I refused to surrender it to a hallucination, or a haunted object, or whatever name one might give it. Summoning courage I barely possessed, I pulled the painting from the table and propped it against the wall again, this time leaning it on the floor. I stared at the image, refusing to look away. My eyes watered, my hands shook, and the cold sweat drenched the back of my neck. But I would not let the fear dominate me. I thought I saw the light in the cabin's window flutter, like a candle guttering. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming certainty that if I gave in to my terror, if I bolted, the thing in that house would grow stronger. So instead, I forced myself to keep gazing, telling it silently that I wasn't afraid, though my racing heart betrayed me. After what felt like an eternity, the air pressure in the room seemed to lift slightly, as though a presence withdrew. My breath came easier. My vision stopped swirling. I waited, ears straining for any creak or moan, but heard only the humming of my refrigerator in the kitchen. Eventually, I noticed my cat had come closer, though she still crouched near the doorway, ears flattened. Her eyes darted from me to the painting. I didn't sleep well that night, but for the first time in days, I didn't dream of the house. The next morning, I noticed the painting looked less imposing, as if it had diminished. The path behind the trees was gone, replaced by a black mass of foliage again. The single window had returned to its dim glow, and the silent tension in the apartment wasn't gone, but it had receded to a faint pulse at the back of my mind. I won't pretend everything returned to normal after that. Occasionally, I still feel the heavy pressure in the living room, as though something stands just out of sight, waiting. My cat remains wary, and there are moments when I glimpse tiny changes in the painting if I let my eyes linger too long. Yet I can breathe a little easier, and I've managed to avoid those soul-chilling nightmares. I haven't found the courage to get rid of the painting. Part of me fears discarding it will unleash a greater evil, while another part of me can't shake a twisted curiosity. It's as if I've become bound to it in some grim pact, a silent agreement between me and whatever lurks in that cabin by the lake. And so I keep it, always aware of its presence, always mindful that those dark dreams might return. Sometimes at night I'll feel a prickling on the back of my neck and recall that half-glimpsed silhouette moving through the window in the painting. My body tenses, my breath catches, and I can almost taste the earthy decay of that porch. But I tell myself I have faced it once, and I can do so again. Whether that's true or not, I have yet to discover. For now, the painting remains on my wall, and I remain in my apartment, our uneasy truce sealed by the knowledge that I have stared into its darkness and lived with the silence that stares back. I first sensed something deeply wrong the moment I stepped onto the property. The silence wasn't the comforting emptiness of a peaceful countryside. It was a charged stillness, like the hush before a thunderstorm. The air felt heavier than it should have, thick enough to make my skin clammy under the bright afternoon sun. I'd come here to escape the city's ceaseless noise, to find a corner of the world where I could work remotely in a serene environment. Instead, the quiet unsettled me. The moment I crossed the threshold of that old farmhouse, I realized that tranquility can sometimes be far more menacing than chaos. My first few days on the site were uneventful enough. The property was modest. One main house, weathered wood and chipped paint, surrounded by a broad field of tall grass, a small storage shed, and a rickety fence in desperate need of repair. I remember feeling a sense of possibility as I organized my makeshift office in the living room, near a window that overlooked a row of ancient oak trees. Yet even then I felt an underlying tension I couldn't name. The forest at the edge of the property stood silent, almost watchful, as if it held its breath each time I walked by. At first I dismissed it as my own paranoia. After all, I was used to the hum of city life and had never spent much time alone in a rural setting. But then I noticed something peculiar in the main house, the narrow attic door. It was set into the ceiling at the end of a short corridor, just wide enough for a small person to squeeze through, yet the door was nailed shut from the inside. I remember tilting my head back to stare at those rusty nails. Why would anyone do that? The landlord, during our initial tour, had made an offhand remark about the attic, saying I'd be better off leaving it alone. I shrugged it off at the time, thinking there might be structural issues or something similarly mundane. Then the sounds began. In the middle of the day, while I worked at my desk, I'd catch faint scratching noises coming from overhead. It almost sounded like small footsteps, light but deliberate. I froze the first time I heard them, every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I put my laptop aside and listened carefully. A few seconds of nothing. Then more of that scratch, like fingernails dragging across wood. My heart hammered so loudly that I could hear my pulse thudding in my ears. When I mentioned the sound to the landlord by phone, he was oddly evasive. He kept repeating that the attic should stay as it is, that I should trust him on this. I tried to push the matter, but he redirected the conversation to something about the property taxes and ended the call. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps squirrels or raccoons had somehow gotten inside. It's an old house after all. But the nails on that attic door, why were they hammered from the inside? Why close something so thoroughly if there was no real threat? Those questions gnawed at me, more persistent than the actual noises. Every night, it got worse. The countryside around me was eerily silent by dusk, except for an occasional gust of wind that rattled the shutters. As I drifted toward sleep, I became hyper-aware of the slightest creak or groan in the woodwork. And then, without fail, I'd hear something brushing against the attic floorboards overhead. My chest would tighten. I'd feel a prickle of sweat forming on my forehead, the sheets tangling around my ankles as I tossed and turned. It was impossible to rest. The next day, I'd wake feeling exhausted, my nerves on edge, as if I'd been running a marathon all night. One particularly bad night, I got up and flicked the hallway light switch, determined to catch whatever was making that noise. Maybe if I checked in the late hours, I'd see a raccoon scurrying into some hidden hole, and that would put my mind at ease. But as soon as I walked into the corridor, the overhead light sputtered and died, leaving me in near darkness. My chest clenched, and the back of my neck felt cold. I took a shaky breath, told myself it was just the bulb burning out, but the next moment a flicker of pale glow danced across the wall, accompanied by the distinct smell of burning wax. It was like the faint glow of a candle, only there was no candle in sight. I stood there, my breathing shallow, convinced I'd see someone standing at the end of the hall. I was poised between running back to my room or standing my ground. Ultimately, I stepped forward to investigate, but before I could take more than 2 steps, the glow disappeared. The corridor was swallowed by darkness. My heart pounded so hard that my legs shook, and I had to brace myself against the wall. When I reached the far end, I found nothing but the quiet hiss of my own frantic breathing. The next morning, I woke with the question still burning in my mind. Why a candle? There were electric lights in the house after all. Was I hallucinating from lack of sleep? My gut told me no. It had felt too real. The smell of burnt wick still clung to my nostrils long after the glow vanished. I ventured outside, hoping some fresh air would do me good. The sun was bright. The farmland around me seemed so peaceful, and I nearly laughed at how silly my fears felt in broad daylight. But the calm didn't last long. Walking to the old storage shed, I had the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My entire spine tingled, as though invisible eyes followed each step. I forced myself to scan the line of trees, the overgrown fields, even the windows of the house. Nothing. Yet my instinct screamed at me that I wasn't alone. Inside the shed, I noticed for the first time that the interior walls had odd markings. They looked like hastily drawn symbols, deeply etched into the wood. Some were triangular shapes intersected by jagged lines, and others were spirals with small crosses at their centers. I stared at them, feeling a chill trickle down my arms. The dryness in my mouth became unbearable, and I swallowed hard. Could these be some kind of protective marks? Or were they meant to summon something? My imagination soared with sinister possibilities. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos, just to make sure I wasn't dreaming. Days bled into nights, and my tension grew. My concentration for work vanished. Instead of drafting reports or responding to emails, I'd find myself standing in the hallway, listening for any hint of movement above. At mealtimes, I'd picture those symbols in the shed, unable to shake the feeling that they were connected to the noises in the attic. My appetite deteriorated. Food turned to tasteless paste in my mouth. Sleep became elusive, replaced by a constant low-level dread that wrapped around me like a vice. Then came the night of the power outage. The sky was moonless, and the darkness outside was absolute. I had just finished a late dinner by candlelight, real, physical candles this time, which I had found in a kitchen drawer, when the entire house was plunged into a deeper gloom. The faint hum of the refrigerator died, and the overhead bulb in the kitchen flickered off. I recall my pulse speeding up, feeling as if I were being tossed into a black void, yet the darkness wasn't complete. Somewhere in the corridor, a dim glow pulsed, like the dying ember of a flame, and with it, that same pungent aroma of melting wax. My palms were slick with sweat as I gripped the edge of the table for balance. A quiver ran through my body, from my chest down to my legs, and I had to fight the urge to flee the house entirely. Instead, I forced myself forward, step by step, propelled by a mix of dread and stubborn determination. My breath came in short gasps, and my heart thundered in my ears. Each footstep felt like it echoed through the entire house. When I reached the hall, I saw the glow dancing across the ceiling. It fluttered erratically, as if someone were holding a candle and moving it in slow circles. A wave of terror nearly made me lose my footing. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I just couldn't. I pressed on, drawn in by a morbid curiosity. As I neared the spot beneath the attic door, the glow shifted upward. It disappeared through the tiny cracks around the door's edges, leaving me in total darkness once more. For an instant, my body froze. Then I felt something, a pressure or presence, right there in the air. It was like an invisible entity stood inches from my face. My skin prickled from head to toe, and the sudden dryness in my mouth made it impossible to swallow. I fumbled back to the kitchen, nearly tripping over my own feet. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I scrambled to find a flashlight. The slender beam cut through the darkness, revealing dust motes swirling in the air. I scanned the hallway, half expecting to see a shape at the corner of my vision. But there was nothing. I let out a shuddering breath, trying to steady myself. The power didn't come back on until early morning. I sat on the couch the entire time, hugging my knees, jumping at the slightest creak or shift in the wind. The next day, I decided I'd had enough. I went outside to get some fresh air, maybe clear my head before calling the landlord and demanding answers. The sun was bright again, the warmth of its rays almost comforting on my face. Yet, I couldn't shake the paranoia. The oak trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted arms. My eyes flicked from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. No one was there, but that creeping sensation of being watched persisted, raising goosebumps on my arms. I trudged over to the storage shed, hoping to see those markings in the daylight, to study them carefully. Maybe I'd research them online or see if they matched any known symbols. But upon entering, my heart almost stopped. New markings had appeared, fresher than before, carved into the wood in shaky lines. My legs felt weak, and a hot flush of fear flooded my face. The shapes looked like variations of the older ones, but more erratic, as if chiseled in haste. My flashlight from the previous night was lying on a workbench, though I had left it on the kitchen table. I reached out, and my hand trembled so badly that I knocked it to the floor. At that point, my sanity felt precarious. I questioned whether I was losing my grip on reality. Had I placed the flashlight there and simply forgotten? Was I carving symbols in my sleep? The notion chilled me to the bone, and my throat went dry at the thought that I might be the culprit without even knowing it. My nights had become a blur of restless half-sleep. Could my paranoia be fueling some kind of sleepwalking? I was equally horrified by the idea that something else was roaming my property, leaving me sinister messages. I phoned the landlord again. My voice shook as I asked what exactly was going on with the attic. He dismissed my concerns, insisting there was nothing to worry about, and that the house had some quirks. When I demanded he come inspect the property with me, he simply repeated that the attic was best left alone. Anger flared inside me. I wanted to shout, to tell him I deserved answers. But the conversation ended abruptly when he claimed to have another call. It was infuriating, and yet, in that frustration, I sensed genuine fear in his tone. Maybe he was as unsettled by that attic as I was. That was my turning point. I couldn't endure the oppressive dread any longer. If I stayed without confronting the attic, I'd eventually crack under the weight of my own terror. So, late that afternoon, I gathered a crowbar, a hammer, and a surge of reckless courage. I positioned myself beneath the attic door, heart pounding. The nails were old and rusted, so it didn't take much force to pry them loose. One by one, they squealed out of the wood, echoing through the silent corridor. My fingers slick with sweat, I pulled the door open. Inside, the attic was low and cramped. Dust particles danced in the beam of my flashlight, swirling like tiny specters. The air up there smelled stagnant, tinged with the acrid stench of burnt wax. I crouched, my breath shallow, stepping carefully across the rickety floorboards. The space was nearly empty, except for a few stacks of yellowed newspapers and some disintegrating boxes. In one corner, I spotted a small circle of melted candle stubs, each one arranged around a crude carving in the floor. It matched the symbols I'd seen in the shed. My stomach churned, and waves of nausea rippled through me. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the flashlight. There was a moment when the floorboards behind me creaked, and I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. No one was there, but the pressure in the attic was suffocating. My lungs felt tight, my body slick with cold sweat. I could sense something intangible, a presence that defied logic. It felt as if it were pressing in on me from all sides. My legs quivered, and a surge of panic welled up so strongly that I found myself stumbling backward toward the attic door. I scrambled down the ladder, slammed the door shut, and rushed out of the house into the last light of day. I wish I could say that was the end of my ordeal. In truth, I never spent another night under that roof. I arranged for a short-term rental in the next town over and began moving my belongings out the following day. The landlord never questioned my decision. He sounded almost relieved, as if he too understood the weight of that place's secrets. Even now, as I sit in my new living space, recalling those final moments in the attic makes my heart race and my mouth go dry. I see flashes of those strange symbols whenever I close my eyes. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll catch a whiff of candle wax, and my skin crawls with the memory of that oppressive darkness overhead. I've come to accept that there are mysteries in this world we aren't meant to dissect. The reason behind that attic's sealed door might remain forever out of reach, locked in the realm of the inexplicable. Perhaps those symbols were wards against something from beyond, or maybe they lured in a force that can't be explained. All I know is the dread that thrived within those walls never truly left me. It followed me, clinging to the corners of my mind like shadows that stretch at twilight. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I stayed, if I forced myself to confront the presence lurking there. Yet I suspect I made the only choice I could. Some places are better left alone. I'll never forget that final glimpse of the attic. The faint impression of a flickering candlelight dancing among the dust motes, and that haunting, silent presence pressing in on me like a living thing. Even now, I can't escape the feeling that I was never alone in that house, that something ancient and restless had claimed that dark space long before I arrived, and it will remain long after I'm gone. I first felt it in my bones before I acknowledged it in my mind. A sense of being watched, of something just beyond the edge of my vision, quietly evaluating my every move. Even now, recalling the way the hairs on the back of my neck prickled under that silent scrutiny makes my stomach turn. It began the day I carried home an unassuming portrait from a cramped antique store, believing I had simply found a tasteful piece of art for my office. I've come to regret that decision with every breath I take, especially at night when the house settles into uneasy silence. I remember the moment I walked into that antique store as if it were suspended in amber. It was one of those places perpetually cloaked in dust motes, with shelves cluttered by chipped figurines, battered leather-bound books, and tarnished candelabras. The smell of aged paper, mildew, and furniture wax was so potent that my nostrils stung. The shopkeeper gave me a cordial nod from behind a towering stack of old diaries and postcards. He seemed used to visitors who were more curious than serious, so he didn't bother with much small talk. I drifted through the narrow aisles, pausing here and there to inspect odd trinkets, until my eyes were caught by the stark figure on a small painting propped against the wall. It depicted a serious-looking man in a dark suit. His expression was stern, almost grim. But what really caught my attention was the uncanny realism in his eyes. It felt as though I were being pinned to the spot by his gaze. My pulse quickened for a beat or two, but at the time I dismissed it as a natural reaction to a well-crafted portrait. The man's hair was short and neat, and his posture suggested some kind of rigid formality. The background was a swirl of muted browns and blacks, making him stand out in vivid detail. His eyes seemed to follow me no matter how I shifted my stance. I asked the shopkeeper about the painting in a casual manner. He responded that it had arrived along with a shipment of estate items, though he had little to add about its origin. There was no signature, no date, nothing to identify its painter. He suggested it might be from the early 20th century, but that was guesswork at best. Despite the faint unease stirring in my gut, I decided it would be a perfect addition to my home office. After all, it was uncommonly well preserved, and I envisioned it adding a certain gravitas to my working space. So I paid for it and left, the heavy wooden frame pressed under my arm, the man's piercing stare seemingly drilling into my ribs through the burlap cover. When I arrived home, I immediately set about finding the ideal spot on my office wall. The room itself is small, with a single window offering scant daylight. It's where I do most of my work, reading and writing at a sturdy oak desk. Once I hung the portrait, I admired how it brought a focused, classical feel to the space. I told myself the expression on the painted man's face was simply austere, a product of some old-fashioned style. Yet, a slight tension gnawed at my throat whenever I looked at it for too long. Initially, I experienced only the mildest sense of disquiet. Whenever I turned away from the portrait to focus on my laptop or a reference book, I felt this strange compulsion to glance back over my shoulder. The man in the painting never changed position, of course, but something about those unwavering eyes made me feel exposed. My heart would thump a little faster, and my breathing got just a tad shallower. Soon I caught myself avoiding direct eye contact with the portrait altogether. I reasoned that it was merely psychological, the product of the painting's exceptional realism and the lonely hush of my office. But then came the night when I woke up with a dry mouth around 3 a.m. and ventured downstairs to get water. My house was dark, the corridors lit only by the faint glow of a street lamp through the windows. I forced myself past the open door of my office, not wanting to peer inside, yet unable to stop myself from glancing in. My entire body tensed, and a cold rush of adrenaline coursed through me when I saw what looked like a shadowy figure perched in my desk chair. For an instant, my heart hammered so violently that I could barely breathe. I blinked, fumbled for the hallway light switch, and when the overhead light came on, the chair was empty. The painting still hung on the wall, the man's silhouette as dark and foreboding as ever. That image of a human shape where it had no right to be lingered in my mind. Even after I returned to bed, I couldn't shake the crawling sensation along my spine, like something was standing in the corner of my bedroom, quietly watching me. I barely slept, drenched in nervous sweat, my pulse booming in my ears. The next morning, my limbs felt heavy with exhaustion. Determined not to let a painting spook me, I closed the office door after finishing my work that day. I told myself it was just to keep the room tidy, but deep down, I knew I wanted a barrier between me and that unrelenting stare. Over the following week, the unsettling moments multiplied. While sitting at my desk late at night, I would detect a faint sound behind me, like the soft scrape of shoes on the hardwood floor. My chest would tighten, and a wave of panic-induced heat would rise up my neck. Each time I would spin around abruptly, heart pounding, only to find nothing but the quiet gloom of my office. The painting always remained in its place, the man's gaze fixed squarely at me. I began moving it around, first to another wall, then placing it on a shelf, then leaning it against the corner behind a file cabinet. No matter where it went, those eyes seemed to follow with the same unnerving intensity. I grew so uneasy that I spoke about it to a friend over the phone. He responded with mild amusement, suggesting I was overworked and letting my imagination run wild. He even recommended that I hide the painting in a closet for a while to see if a change of scenery would soothe my nerves. Taking that advice, I stashed the portrait in a downstairs closet behind some spare blankets. I fully expected to feel immediate relief once it was out of sight. Instead, my dreams took a darker turn. I began experiencing nightmares about tall silhouettes standing beside my bed. In these dreams, I would jolt awake, still dreaming, though I didn't realize it at the time, to find the man from the painting looming over me. His face would be just as severe as ever, but now the eyes seemed to glow with a faintly menacing light. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, my heart galloping like a terrified animal. In those moments of jarring consciousness, I was convinced I heard slow, deliberate footsteps receding down the hallway. During the day, my paranoia escalated. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a reflection of that man creeping up behind me in the computer monitor. My stomach twisted into knots whenever I set foot in the office. There was an oppressive atmosphere in there, a thickness in the air that made it hard to inhale calmly. The overhead lights seemed weaker, and the corners looked darker, as though shadows clung to them longer than they should. Sometimes I caught whiffs of something faintly reminiscent of old cologne, a musty fragrance too ancient to be mine. Eventually, curiosity and dread wrestled for dominance in my mind. I had to see if removing the painting from the office had truly changed anything. One afternoon, I retrieved it from the closet to inspect it more thoroughly. I ran my hands over the frame, hoping I might discover a hidden signature, date, or some cryptic marking. My fingertips tingled with an odd warmth, almost like the frame itself was pulsing. I searched every inch and found nothing. The paint was smooth, the details lifelike in a way that shouldn't be possible for such an old work. Those eyes, they seemed more vivid than ever, as though they had become sharper with the passage of time. I decided to place the painting on the desk. It felt like a reckless challenge, but I was desperate for answers. Night fell soon after, and I sat there under the single lamp, the rest of the room swallowed in shadows, confronting that portrait in silence. My palms felt clammy, and I noticed my breathing was uneven. My heartbeat drummed in my ears as I stared into the painted man's eyes, straining to detect the slightest flicker of movement. I'm not sure how long I sat like that. Maybe an hour, maybe two. The tension weighed on my shoulders, my temples throbbing. Suddenly, in the silence, I heard a soft creak from beneath the desk, like someone shifting their weight. Every muscle in my body seized, and I fought the urge to jump out of my chair. The inside of my mouth went dry, and a cold sweat broke across my brow. My gaze snapped downward, but there was nothing there. It was just the old wood settling, I told myself. Yet I couldn't quell the prickling sensation on my skin, as if something was crawling under it. I quickly stood, intending to put the painting back in the closet, but paused when I thought I glimpsed a subtle tilt to the man's head, as though he had angled it slightly to follow me. I retreated from the room in a near panic, flipping off the light and shutting the door behind me with trembling hands. That night, I locked the office door. I didn't even want the chance of glimpsing anything inside. Sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, hearing my own heartbeat pound, picturing the portrait in the dark office, imagining that imposing figure stepping out of the canvas, pacing around the desk. Several times I almost got up to throw the painting outside or toss it in the garbage. But a deep, unexplainable apprehension stopped me, like part of me believed removing it the wrong way would provoke something far worse. Over the next few days, my nerves were consistently frayed. I noticed a series of inexplicable occurrences. A single muddy footprint near my office door, though I had no trace of dirt on my own shoes. A faint tapping sound late at night, as if knuckles were rapping on wood from behind closed doors. Once I caught a glimpse of a reflection in the window, a tall figure standing behind me, wearing what could only be a suit jacket. I turned, adrenaline spiking through my veins, but there was no one there. My ears rang with the rush of blood, and I realized my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my phone. The house itself felt different, colder, and unwelcoming. I started hearing the hum of my fridge as though it were a loud drone, and every minor creak or whisper of wind against the walls made me jump. My tension was becoming unbearable, my breathing shallow. More than once I questioned my own sanity, wondering if stress had finally cracked my composure. Had I conjured this presence from my own anxieties? Or was there truly some entity latched onto that portrait, feeding off my dread? One night, unable to endure another moment of uneasy sleep, I decided I had to confront the situation head-on. So I marched into the office. I placed the painting upright on the desk, turning my desk lamp to shine directly on it. The rest of the room was bathed in darkness. My heart pounded so fiercely it made my ribs ache. I felt goosebumps prickling along my arms, and a trickle of sweat rolled down my temple. Though I spoke aloud briefly, just a hushed question of what the man in the portrait wanted, there was no answer, no dramatic shift in the shadows. Still, I sensed that I wasn't alone. The air became stifling, and I could almost feel a set of eyes burning into my face. Then, in the silent tension, I detected the barest flicker from the painting's surface, as though the figure's outline pulsed once. My vision blurred for a moment. My knees threatened to buckle. I gasped, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself it was a trick of the light. Yet the sensation of dread was so powerful, it felt as if something had reached into my chest and squeezed my lungs. I steeled myself, snatched the painting up, and carried it to the storage room in the basement. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if invisible hands were pushing against me, trying to force me to drop to my knees. My skin prickled with electric tension, but I pressed on, ignoring the dreadful thought that I was being followed with every movement. The basement smelled of concrete and stagnant air. I wedged the painting behind an old wardrobe, out of sight, out of mind. At least that was my hope. For several nights, the house seemed calmer. I still felt uneasy, but the presence wasn't as overt. I locked my office door every evening to prevent accidental sightings that could spark terror anew. Little by little, I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, I had banished whatever aura had been lingering. I stopped hearing the tapping. The creaks seemed normal again, and I no longer dreamed of a shadowy figure looming over my bed. But one morning, I woke to find the office door ajar, even though I had locked it. My pulse quickened as I peered inside. The desk lamp was on, a thin halo of light illuminating the corner, yet I hadn't used the office the previous night. My breath caught when I saw an object on the desk. The painting, standing upright in perfect position, its subject glaring with an air of cold accusation. My nerves erupted in a surge of panic so sharp that I felt dizzy. My palms were slick with sweat, and I could feel my heart hammering against my rib cage like it was trying to escape. That painting should have been in the basement. Yet here it was again, as though it had returned of its own accord. It took all my willpower not to panic and flee. Instead, I slid the painting back into its frame, turned it face down, and pulled out an old blanket to cover it. With trembling hands, I carried it into the garage, where I decided I would store it indefinitely. The entire walk, I was convinced something was right behind me, so close that I should have felt breath on my neck. My skin crawled, and I practically slammed the garage door behind me, breathing in shallow gasps, my heart still thudding. It's been a few days since that morning. I've had no further incidents, though the hush in my house has a weight to it that wasn't there before. I keep the garage locked now, telling myself that it's just for added security. In truth, I can't stand the thought of stumbling upon that portrait again. Whenever I pass by the garage door, I'm overwhelmed by the sense that it knows I'm there. My stomach twists with an uneasy guilt, as though I've done something to anger a force that is both silent and unrelenting. I can still feel that watchful presence lingering around me, especially when the night is quiet and my mind wanders to the painting's unwavering gaze. A part of me wonders if I should just get rid of it, but fear of some unknown reprisal stays my hand. Another part wonders if I've been imagining it all, conjuring nightmares from stress. But deep down, I suspect the man in the portrait is more than just pigment on canvas. Something about his intense stare suggests an awareness that isn't bound by paint or wood. I'm left in a permanent state of restless vigilance. I jump at small noises, keep all the lights on in the evening, and do everything to avoid walking near the garage after dark. It's like the painting has infected my home with its oppressive aura, settling into every crevice until there is no escaping that feeling of being watched. Even as I write these words, a cold shiver coils around my spine. My pulse skitters in my neck, and my fingers tremble on the keyboard. I can almost sense that stern visage looming at the edge of my periphery, always waiting. So here I am, existing in a place where reality and dread intersect, unsure if the threat is supernatural or a product of my own unraveling mind. I haven't told anyone else about the painting's reappearance, nor do I plan to. Some burdens are too strange, too personal to share. At least I haven't seen any new shadows behind my desk or heard footsteps in the hallway. But that doesn't mean I feel safe. There is no comfort in my home anymore. No corner that isn't haunted by the memory or the presence of that old portrait. And the hardest part is knowing that I may never truly escape it. I remain here in this uneasy truce, hoping the sensation of being watched subsides, while dreading the moment it escalates into something far worse. I still feel the chill in my bones whenever I think about the first message. It arrived exactly at 2:59 a.m., a time that felt oddly significant, just shy of 3 a.m., the so-called witching hour. The screen glowed on my nightstand, pulling me out of an uneasy half-sleep. The room was silent except for my own breathing, which sounded too loud, too frantic against the stillness of the night. When I picked up the phone, my hand trembled in a way that I couldn't explain. The sender was listed as unknown. No number, no name. Just that single word, unknown. The message made no sense at first. It read something like a half-coherent description of the exact position of my hand on the bedsheet, the bend of my elbow, the angle of my head against the pillow. It was as though someone was watching me with unwavering attention. My stomach tightened with a sudden rush of fear, and an odd electrical tension coursed through my veins. I sat up, the blankets bunched around my waist, scanning the dark corners of my room. Every shift of shadow felt intrusive. Every sound from the creaking walls amplified into a roar in my ears. Nothing in the darkness offered any explanation. All I could do was lock my phone, place it face down, and try to convince myself this was some malicious prank. It wasn't. In the following nights, the messages came again, always near that same hour. At first, they were simply disconcerting lines describing my posture, my location in the apartment, or even the scattered details of my thoughts. One of them even mentioned the exact phrase I had silently formed in my mind a moment earlier, a phrase I hadn't even said out loud. That was when real dread set in. My breath hitched, and my heart pounded so violently, I could hear the surge of blood in my ears. Each time the phone chimed, the air in my bedroom seemed to vanish, replaced by a suffocating tension that made my skin clammy. I tried to laugh it off a few days later, even hinting to a friend during a casual conversation that someone was playing mind games with me. He responded in a concerned tone, suggesting it might be stress or exhaustion. He urged me to sleep more, to turn the phone off at night. I told him I would, but deep down, I knew that ignoring the messages wouldn't stop my rising panic. There was no real peace in silence, just the slower, more agonizing anticipation of something unknown. The next significant incident happened about a week after the messages started. I was sitting at my desk, late into the night, scribbling some notes into a battered notebook. The phone was on silent mode to keep me from flinching at every chime, but I still checked it compulsively. At 3:01 a.m., there it was again, unknown. The text said, "Don't turn around. I'm right beside you." For a moment, I felt a suffocating wave of dizziness. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart hammered so hard, I was sure it would burst. The edges of my vision seemed to flicker, and my fingers went cold, almost numb against the notebook. I forced myself to pivot my chair, though I did it as slowly as possible, as if turning faster might startle whatever might be there. When I finally faced the empty doorway, there was nothing. My bedroom light was dim, casting a subdued glow that melted into the darkness of the hallway. It felt like the darkness was pressing in, creeping closer with every second I stared. It didn't help that my apartment building is old, with walls that groan in the middle of the night. The heating system has this faint rattling hum that feels alive when you're alone at 3 a.m. And then there's the flickering street lamp right outside my window, casting uneven beams of light through the gaps in the curtains. The space never truly felt like home before, but now it seemed like every corner had its own malicious heartbeat, waiting to pounce on the slightest vulnerability. I started losing sleep. I'd lie awake until dawn, body drenched in sweat, muscles tensed for an imminent threat that never manifested in any tangible form. My eyes played tricks on me in the shadows. Brief flashes of a figure crouched by the closet, a flicker of movement by the window, or the suggestion of a silhouette in the bathroom mirror. Each time, when I'd flick on a light, it was just the same empty room. Yet that emptiness felt hostile, charged with an unseen presence. One night, in a futile attempt to reclaim some sense of normalcy, I put my phone on airplane mode. At around 2:30 a.m., I was half dozing, half listening to the faint street traffic outside, when I felt the phone vibrate. Even on airplane mode, it buzzed against the bedside table. My pulse surged, sweat trickled down the back of my neck, and a prickling sensation crawled over my scalp. The phone's screen lit up in the darkness, and I reached for it with trembling fingers. Unknown again. The message said, "Airplane mode won't help. Stop trying to hide." My lungs constricted, and each breath became a painful struggle. My entire body felt leaden, as though I were pinned under the weight of an oppressive force. I yanked the covers off and stumbled to the bathroom, switching on the bright overhead light and splashing cold water on my face. My reflection in the mirror was gaunt, eyes wild with terror. The overhead light buzzed, flickering for a moment, and in that flicker, I could have sworn I saw another face behind my shoulder. I pivoted so quickly that I almost lost my balance. Nothing, just the empty hallway stretching behind me. I tried rational measures. I downloaded apps to trace calls and text messages. Everything came back inconclusive. My phone company insisted that no such messages were being logged. They seemed to think I was mistaken or that someone had gained unauthorized access to my device. A representative suggested I perform a factory reset. I did, convinced that would solve it. It didn't. Within a day, the texts resumed. They became more disturbing, referencing personal childhood memories, inner fears, and hidden regrets I'd never shared with anyone. I felt my sanity fraying. Doubts plagued me. Was I losing my mind? Was my phone somehow corrupted by a virus that used my personal data against me? But how would it know what I was thinking at that precise moment? How could it describe my immediate surroundings with such accuracy, especially things I had never documented or photographed? After nearly 2 weeks of this, I decided to stay up all night in the living room, determined to confront whatever was happening. Around 2:45 a.m., I closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and sat in an armchair that overlooked the entire space. The only glow came from the street lamp filtering through a small gap in the curtain, painting a faint yellow streak across the worn carpet. My heartbeat throbbed in my temples, and I gripped the arms of the chair until my knuckles felt numb. At exactly 3 a.m., the phone lit up, momentarily illuminating my pale, drawn face. The text arrived as if on cue. "Why are you hiding in the dark? I can still see you." My skin crawled. My breath turned shallow, and a sharp ache stabbed at my chest. The hair on my arms stood on end. I couldn't bring myself to look away from that message. There was no way to rationalize it anymore. No explanation felt sufficient. In that moment of suffocating anxiety, I noticed a sound, like soft shuffling footsteps on the other side of the curtain. My throat tightened, and I shifted my gaze to the window. The shape of a figure seemed to materialize in the faint light, but it was so vague, like a smear of darkness. My blood turned to ice as I realized this shape was lingering, as if peering right in. My entire body locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. Then a sudden draft made the curtain ripple, and the silhouette vanished. I stood up slowly, struggling to steady my trembling legs, and hurried to yank the curtain open. Outside, only the quiet street, the flickering lamp, and a vacant sidewalk. That was the moment I decided I couldn't endure this any longer. I powered off my phone and vowed not to turn it back on until daylight. I needed some rest, some reprieve from the constant assault on my nerves. My bed beckoned, and despite the suffocating fear, exhaustion took over. I collapsed onto the mattress, heart still pounding but too weary to remain conscious. In my dreams, I wandered a hallway lined with doors that opened into glimpses of my own memories. Embarrassing moments, hidden shames, private anxieties. In each memory, I sensed an onlooker just outside my field of vision, a presence that watched me without blinking. My body would jolt awake every time I felt that presence step closer, but every waking brought me back to the same bleak bedroom, soaked in sweat, ears ringing in the silent gloom. By morning, my reflection in the mirror was nearly unrecognizable. I tried to go about my day as usual, but everything felt wrong. The sunlight seemed sterile rather than comforting. The faces of strangers on the street unnervingly distant. Paranoia clung to me like a second skin. My neck felt stiff, as though I was perpetually bracing for an unexpected touch. When I finally forced myself to turn my phone on again, I discovered multiple missed texts from unknown. Each told me I couldn't escape. Each one explicitly named my location at the time it was sent. The grocery store, the coffee shop, the public restroom I had quickly used to splash water on my face and fight back mounting panic. I started to suspect that maybe this presence wasn't human at all. How else could it track my movements so precisely? I questioned every shadow in the corner of my vision. Was I followed by something that slipped between cracks in reality? The question gnawed at me. That night, determined to break the chain of fear, I decided to confront it in the only way I could think of. I sat in my dimly lit kitchen and directed my thoughts to whatever might be watching. I thought about my defiance, about refusing to be terrorized, about my desire to challenge it head-on if it truly existed. A few minutes before 3 a.m., I felt a change in the atmosphere. The kitchen lights flickered, then steadied. My phone vibrated. The text said, "You will never be alone." My veins turned to ice. Every hair on my body stood on end. My heart battered my rib cage like it was trying to escape. But instead of shutting down, I gripped the edges of the table so hard my arms shook. My teeth were clenched, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I refused to leave the chair, even as the kitchen light dimmed inexplicably, casting wavering shadows along the walls. I heard a barely perceptible noise from behind me, like the faint rasp of a breath or the softest brush against the floor. Goosebumps erupted across my skin. In my peripheral vision, there was a dark shape, indistinct and wavering, near the refrigerator. My mind screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stand and turn slowly to face it. The shape seemed to ripple, as if struggling to remain in this reality. My throat felt parched, and my vision blurred with the intensity of raw terror. I took one uncertain step forward, then another, feeling cold sweat dripping down my spine. The shape dissolved into the darkness around it. The single overhead light in my kitchen surged back to full brightness, revealing nothing but an empty space. My phone vibrated once more. The message read, "So close, yet so far." My chest constricted again, and I realized I was on the verge of hyperventilating. I slammed the phone face down on the table, my body shaking uncontrollably, tears of frustration and fear stinging my eyes. In the days that followed, I tried to leave my apartment at night, hoping that if I changed my routine, the messages would stop. I walked aimlessly through well-lit streets, resisting the urge to check my phone. When I finally came home just before dawn, I found another message waiting. "Light doesn't stop me. You know that by now." That line sent me into a spiral of despair. My sleep was reduced to mere minutes here and there, punctuated by jolts of panic whenever I heard the slightest noise. My appetite vanished. Every time I tried to eat, I felt nauseated by the anxiety coiled in my gut. Eventually, the messages started to shift in tone. They became less taunting, more insistent, almost like pleas or commands I couldn't fully understand. They spoke of boundaries, the spaces between dreams and waking reality, the cracks through which something was trying to crawl. I felt a deepening sense of unease, like each new text was eroding the barrier between my mind and a lurking force that wished to consume or overshadow me. I decided to travel to an old cabin I once rented for solitude, far from the city. It sat near a stretch of dense woods, where no street lamps or neighbors could intrude. I thought maybe isolation in nature would sever the connection. For the first few hours there, my phone remained silent. A creeping sense of relief started to form, giving me space to breathe. The forest around the cabin was silent but alive with rustling leaves, distant nocturnal animals, and the whisper of the wind through the pines. Even though it was dark, it felt almost peaceful compared to the oppressive feeling in my apartment. But just as I began to think I'd escaped, the phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I froze, the chill of dread slithering down my spine. I pulled the phone out with shaking hands and saw the same ominous text. Unknown. It read, "Do you finally see? There's no place to run." My chest constricted, and my lungs seized up as though I'd been plunged into icy water. I scanned the darkness outside the cabin. The moonlight painted ghostly patterns on the trees, and every rustle of branches seemed amplified into a threat. That's when I realized there was no permanent way to rid myself of whatever this was. My only path forward was to confront it. I placed the phone on the cabin's rickety wooden table, forced myself to sit on a worn chair, and waited. My entire body trembled in rhythmic waves of fear. My breathing was rapid, uneven, and every heartbeat felt like a hammer striking my ribs. The phone flickered to life, not just with a text, but the screen itself turning on for no apparent reason. It glowed steadily, casting an eerie light against the cabin's walls. I stared at it with wide, unblinking eyes, and in that moment of raw terror, a strange calm washed over me. I understood something fundamental. Perhaps the messages weren't just threats. They were a twisted form of beckoning, a way to force me to acknowledge a reality I'd been trying to deny. I reached for the phone and typed a single reply, though I had no reason to believe it would go through. "I see you." My finger hovered over the send button, and for a heartbeat, everything felt suspended. My breath caught, my pulse roared in my ears, and I sent the message. The phone screen went dark. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The night felt as silent as a grave, my body locked in anticipation. Then, the phone vibrated once, a single burst that nearly made me drop it. I looked at the screen, and there was one final text from unknown. "We are never apart." At that moment, a suffocating pressure filled the cabin, like the air itself was folding in. I stumbled to my feet, head throbbing, vision warping at the edges. It felt as though something pressed against my senses, trying to merge with my thoughts. My breathing came in ragged bursts, my heart pounded like thunder in my chest, and sweat streamed down my temples. Summoning every ounce of willpower I had left, I lurched out the cabin door into the cool night air. The darkness embraced me, but the crushing pressure began to subside. Inside my jacket pocket, the phone was silent. No more vibrations, no more texts. I stood there, gulping in the forest air, my legs trembling as if they might give out at any moment. Eventually, a faint breeze stirred the branches overhead. The moon's cold glow revealed nothing lurking, nothing pursuing. And yet, I couldn't shake the persistent awareness that I was not alone, that maybe I could never be alone again. By dawn, I gathered my things and left the cabin. I felt an uncanny mixture of dread and relief. No new messages arrived on my drive home. In the city, the sunlight felt harsh and unwelcoming, but at least it was real. Undeniably real. For a time, the phone remained silent, though I found myself checking it constantly, half expecting another cryptic text to appear. The paranoia still clung to me, an unrelenting fear that any second might bring the return of that presence. I don't claim to have rid myself of whatever haunted me. I've simply learned to live with the tension, to function in spite of the uncertainty. Sometimes, late at night, I sense a flicker in my peripheral vision, or my phone lights up for no apparent reason. My heartbeat always spikes, and my stomach twists in apprehension. But so far, no new message has appeared. Perhaps it's finished with me, or perhaps it's just waiting for the right moment to remind me that we truly are never apart. Even now, as I write these final lines, I glance at the phone face down on the table. The memory of those messages lingers like a stale breath on my neck. Although the screen remains dark and silent, I can't help wondering if a chime will break the quiet, forcing me to question once again what is real and what has taken root in my mind. And if that chime ever comes, I know I'll be right back in that old familiar nightmare, heart pounding, breath catching, skin cold with sweat, reminded that, whatever this is, it refuses to let go. I still remember the exact moment my peaceful routine began to unravel. It was precisely 10:30 p.m., and my eyes were glued to the TV in my cramped studio apartment. A single overhead light buzzed faintly as the show's plot reached a climax. But before I could even register what was happening on the screen, the image flickered into static. The noise was a rapid crackle, an ugly hiss that sliced through the silence. Almost simultaneously, the light above me flickered. Once, twice, then went back to normal. A chill prickled across my arms, though I told myself it had to be a random glitch. My internet connection was robust, and I knew it shouldn't be failing at such a consistent time, but I dismissed it as a technical hiccup. That's what I told myself anyway. I was trying to hold on to logic. Yet deep down, something felt very wrong. I live in one of those cramped city studios where the living room is basically an old couch facing a tiny television, and the kitchen is little more than a fridge, a sink, and a small counter jammed against the opposite wall. My bed sits in a recessed area I like to call my sleeping nook. Although it's barely separated by a flimsy divider, it's the kind of place you move into when you're determined to live on your own, but can't afford anything bigger. The stale air sometimes mingles with cooking smells, creating an odd mixture of detergent, old coffee, and reheated meals. At night, the single window next to the bed barely lets in any moonlight, so everything feels shadowy and closed in. I used to love that cozy atmosphere. Lately, it just feels suffocating. It started slowly, these weird disturbances. The very first time I noticed them, I shrugged them off, rationalizing that every old building in this area has some electrical quirks. But it was always at 10:30 p.m. The screen would show a burst of white noise, like the old analog TVs used to do, before returning to the program. Then I realized the overhead bulb and even the small lamp near my couch would flicker just enough to catch my attention. My heart would speed up, and a faint sense of dread would coil in my gut. Still, I tried to be practical. I bought new LED bulbs, replaced power cords, updated the software on my TV, and even tested the internet speed. Everything checked out as normal. No reason to suspect anything supernatural or bizarre. But the static didn't go away. A couple of weeks in, that static started to carry a faint sound I couldn't quite identify. It was like a garbled whisper, or maybe multiple whispers layered atop one another, so jumbled I couldn't isolate a single word. Each time it happened, my pulse would pound in my ears, and my breathing would come faster. I'd stare at the screen, half expecting a jump scare from some glitchy face or horrifying silhouette. Yet the image would return to normal after just a few seconds, as though nothing had ever happened. It began to fill me with a creeping sense of unease. By the time the flicker and static would stop, I'd be drenched in cold sweat. One evening, I decided to turn off every appliance in the studio at 10:29 p.m., just to see if the phenomenon was connected to something draining power. I switched off all the lights, the TV, my laptop, even the fridge. I stood there in the dim glow of a street lamp shining in through my small window. The silence pressed against my ears, and my skin felt clammy with a mixture of anticipation and fear. I held my phone in my hand to check the time. The digital clock read 10:30 p.m. Right on cue, I heard a faint pop, like static, though everything was completely turned off. A wave of goosebumps traveled up my arms and my scalp tingled with an uncomfortable awareness. Whatever this was, it wasn't a simple technical glitch. Things escalated a few nights later. I was watching TV again, trying to distract myself from the knot of anxiety that had become a near constant companion. Half paying attention, I heard the faint rattle of something metallic. My gaze flicked from the screen to the kitchen area. It sounded like utensils clattering, as if someone was rummaging through the drawer. My stomach tightened. My mouth went dry. I paused the show, listening intently. The rattle continued, soft, intermittent, but distinctly coming from the drawer where I keep my forks, spoons, and knives. It was impossible to ignore. My pulse throbbed in my temples, and each step I took toward the kitchen made my muscles tense. When I finally reached the drawer, heart hammering, I yanked it open, expecting to find something jostling about. But everything was exactly where it should be. Forks stacked, spoons nested, knives lined up. No sign of anything out of place. The sense of being watched was almost unbearable. My eyes darted around that small space, searching for an intruder. The overhead light seemed dimmer than before, casting elongated shadows on the walls. I couldn't shake the impression that something was lurking just beyond my field of vision, some presence that my instincts could sense, but that my eyes couldn't confirm. A wave of nausea hit me as I tried to rationalize the noise. Perhaps the building had shifted slightly, or vibrations from a passing truck had rattled the drawer. But a part of me knew it was too specific, too deliberate in its timing. As the days passed, I found myself growing more paranoid. Every time 10:30 approached, I'd brace for the flicker of the lights and the static on the TV. My palms would start sweating around 10:25, and I'd feel my heart rate spike as the minutes ticked by. I tried to talk about it with a friend over the phone, though I kept my tone casual, not wanting to sound unhinged. I explained that I was having weird electrical issues. My friend, who knew a bit about wiring, suggested I check the breaker box or maybe call an electrician to do a thorough inspection. I nodded along, feeling the tension in my chest as I realized that I'd already done all the superficial checks. I tried to convey that the problem felt bigger than old wiring, but I couldn't bring myself to say it outright. I even scheduled a visit from an electrician who tested the system and found nothing out of the ordinary. Every reading looked normal. By then, my sleep was a mess. I'd toss and turn, drifting into shallow, uneasy dreams. Sometimes I'd hear a whisper in the middle of the night, like someone calling my name from the corner of the room. My body would jerk awake, drenched in sweat, heart threatening to burst out of my chest. In those bleary moments between sleeping and waking, I'd sense a figure standing near my bed. I'd blink furiously, trying to clear my vision, but it was always gone when my eyes adjusted to the dark. The worst part wasn't just the static, the flickering lights, or the strange rattling in the drawer. It was the growing certainty that I wasn't alone. An intangible presence seemed to linger around me, as though feeding on my fear. My studio felt smaller and smaller, the walls practically closing in. I started noticing subtle changes in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped unexpectedly in certain spots. The air became oppressively still, as if all ventilation stopped. The hair on the back of my neck would stand up at random times, accompanied by a prickling at my temples. No matter where I turned, I felt eyes on me. I remember one night in particular. It was a Saturday, and I was determined not to let this bizarre routine dictate my life. I turned on some upbeat music, trying to lighten the mood. I even cooked a proper meal for once, a simple pasta dish, because I wanted something normal in my day. Yet as the clock neared 10:30, my skin broke out in goosebumps. I paused the music and stood in the center of my studio, arms folded tightly across my chest. I watched the second hand on my wall clock move. Right when it hit 10:30, a dull hum filled the air, so low I could feel it resonate in my bones. The overhead light flickered rapidly, casting strobing shadows on every surface. The TV, which was turned off, suddenly emitted a screech of static. I stood frozen, my hands trembling. My breath caught in my throat. Then an echo of that same metal rattling filled the air. This time it was louder, more violent, as though someone was deliberately shaking the drawer. My body locked up. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. For a split second, the corner of my eye caught something, a distortion in the air, like a wavering shape near the kitchen. My vision blurred, tears welling up from sheer terror. When the rattling finally stopped, it left behind a deafening silence. My knees wobbled, and I slumped onto the couch, adrenaline surging through my veins. That night, I barely slept. My head throbbed with a migraine, and my muscles were stiff from clenching them so hard. I kept glancing at the drawer, half expecting it to spring open on its own. Every little creak in the apartment building made me flinch. Every passing car outside made me jump. By the time morning arrived, I felt ragged, as though I'd aged overnight. I was beginning to question whether I was losing my mind. Out of desperation, I sought any kind of rational explanation. I even considered that maybe my neighbor's apartment shared some weird wiring that caused interference, but none of my neighbors reported a similar issue. I tried to distract myself with work. During the day, my studio felt almost normal, bathed in sunlight, albeit subdued by the single window's position. But as dusk settled, my anxiety would creep back in. I took to leaving every possible light on before 10:30, hoping it would help. It didn't. Sometimes I wondered if something had attached itself to this place long before I moved in. I thought about the building's history, but my landlord had never mentioned anything unusual. Of course, people don't always disclose what they don't want you to know. My thoughts spiraled into paranoia. I pictured the place's previous tenants, imagining them going through the same torment but never speaking about it, afraid of sounding crazy. Every flicker, every hiss, every whisper in the static seemed to be pushing me toward a breaking point. My body felt constantly on edge, flooded with cortisol or adrenaline or whatever chemical signals the brain sends out in a fight or flight scenario. My hands were shaky, my appetite dwindled to nothing, and even my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked alien. Pale skin, dark circles under my eyes, a twitchy expression that radiated fear. I reached a tipping point on a night when a loud clattering from the kitchen jolted me out of a half-doze on the couch. I jumped up, heart galloping, and approached the kitchen carefully. The overhead light was dim again, flickering just enough to cast ghostly shapes on the walls. The drawer where I kept my utensils was rattling, as if someone inside it was desperately trying to get out. My breath came in shallow gasps. I crept closer, sweat cold on my forehead. When I pulled the drawer open, the rattling stopped abruptly. Inside, the utensils were vibrating as if they'd just been set in motion. My mind whirled, searching for logic, but none came. Then from behind me, a soft tap, tap, tap sounded on the wall. I spun around, chest heaving, but saw nothing. Just my reflection in the turned-off TV screen, eyes wild and terrified. I stood there, feeling my heartbeat slam against my ribcage. My limbs went numb, and for a moment, I thought I would collapse. Then, in the reflection of the TV, I caught a glimpse of movement in the far corner of the room, like a blur of darkness shifting. My entire body erupted in goosebumps, and I clenched my fists, unsure if I should run out the door or confront whatever was there. My rational mind screamed that there couldn't be anyone physically present, yet my senses told me otherwise. In a surge of desperation, I whipped around, ready to confront the presence. The air felt thick, almost gelatinous, and my lungs labored to draw breath. I can't say I saw a full figure, but I sensed something, an outline in the gloom, intangible yet unmistakably real. A wave of raw terror swept through me, and I let out a trembling exhalation that sounded like a choked sob. My instincts urged me to leave, to run for the door and never look back. I reached for the doorknob, my hand slick with sweat, and flung it open. Without even thinking to grab my keys or phone, I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air as though the apartment itself were trying to suffocate me. I don't know how long I stayed out there, my back against the corridor's cold concrete wall. The building's corridor lights buzzed softly, a comforting normality compared to the insanity inside my place. Once my heartbeat slowed to something manageable, I realized I couldn't just abandon my home. My stuff, my life, everything was in there. Summoning courage I didn't think I had, I stepped back inside. The studio was eerily quiet. The clock showed it was well past 10:30, closer to 11. No flickering, no rattling. But the heavy atmosphere persisted, like the residue of something that had just left. That night marked a turning point. From then on, I felt less like a terrified victim and more like someone determined to reclaim their space. I began to observe the events more calmly, keeping a detailed notebook about each incident. I'd note if the flicker lasted longer, if the static had any discernible pattern in its sound, if there were temperature drops before or after the lights blinked. My fear still hovered in the background, but now there was also a grim resolve. I refused to let this presence, whatever it was, push me out of my own home. On the final night before I decided to leave the apartment temporarily, the static came through the TV again at 10:30. My entire body braced for the usual flicker of lights, which duly arrived, turning my studio into a momentary strobe-lit nightmare. But this time, the static on the screen didn't subside. It kept going, a harsh crescendo of noise that made me clamp my hands over my ears. Out of the corner of my eye, the drawer in the kitchen flew open with a clang, utensils scattering across the floor. My breath hitched, and I wheeled toward the sound. In a split second, I saw a dark shape rush across the room, heading toward the door, as if fleeing from the chaos it created. My heart hammered so violently I thought my chest would burst. Then everything went still. The lights stabilized, the TV went black, and the utensils lay strewn across the floor, glinting in the overhead light as though mocking me. That was the moment I realized I could not continue living there as I had been. I packed a small bag of essentials, left the utensils where they lay, and bolted into the night. I ended up staying at a friend's place for a few days, using every moment away to reflect on what I'd experienced. My friend tried to rationalize the situation, but I could see the concern in their eyes, that flicker of doubt about my story. Still, I couldn't ignore my intuition. Something in that apartment was beyond normal explanation. Eventually, I gathered my courage and returned, determined to confront the unsettling atmosphere on my terms. I made my way back into the studio, each step tinged with trepidation. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, as if awaiting my return. The moment I stepped inside, my anxiety spiked. Yet there was also a strange sense of finality. I walked over to the scattered utensils, picked them up, and placed them methodically back into the drawer. A trembling breath escaped my lips as I closed it. My reflection in the blank TV screen stared back at me, pale but steadfast. I've stayed ever since, though nothing about it feels resolved. The disturbances continue sporadically, each occurrence pushing me to the brink of my sanity. But I remain, partly because I refuse to be driven out by something invisible, and partly because I need to understand what's really happening. At night, I still feel that oppressive heaviness in the room. Sometimes I sense a flicker of motion at the periphery of my vision, or a rustle near the kitchen. My nerves are frayed, my body perpetually on alert, but I haven't run again. Each time I battle the urge to flee, I remind myself that I can't live under this shadow of fear forever. Now, whenever the clock nears 10:30 p.m., I brace myself. My breathing turns shallow, my palms sweat, my heart races, and without fail, the lights flicker and the TV or some unseen force hisses static into the darkness. I suspect there's something here that defies explanation, something that feeds on my fear or thrives in the tension it creates. I don't know if I'll ever banish it completely. Some nights I think about moving out for good, but I can't shake the feeling that if I do, it might follow me wherever I go. Maybe it's part of the building, or maybe it's part of me now. Even as I write this, the air feels thick, almost electric, and my eyes keep darting to the corners of the room. There's no neat conclusion, no easy closure. I'm here, and so is it. Perhaps this is a standoff, a test of wills, or maybe it's something else entirely, a mystery that will remain unanswered. All I know is that each night, that sense of dread returns, unwavering, relentless. And each night I endure it, uncertain whether I'm overcoming my terror or succumbing to something darker. The final truth is that the static still comes, the lights still flicker, and the rattling persists just out of sight. That lingering unease is now a part of my daily life, a persistent reminder that there are forces we don't understand, lurking just at the edge of our perception, waiting to break through when we least expect it. I remember the very first night I heard it ring. It was just past 3 in the morning when that piercing sound cut through the silence of my home office, jarring me awake with a jolt of sheer panic. My eyes flew open in the darkness, and my pulse immediately thundered against my ribs. For a split second, I thought I might be dreaming. After all, the phone was unplugged. Nothing more than a relic perched on my desk to give the space a vintage charm. It didn't even have a line connected to the wall. Yet the shrill metallic ring was unmistakable, echoing along the hallway and seizing my full attention. Even before my mind had a chance to rationalize, my body was already moving, heart pounding, feet stumbling out of bed toward my office door. I'd acquired that antique telephone at a flea market a few years back. I was drawn to its sturdy shape and brass accents, and I liked the idea of adding something nostalgic to the otherwise modern style of my workspace. Installing an active line for it had never crossed my mind. To me, it was an artifact, a decorative piece that reminded me of a time before smartphones and endless notifications. So the moment I heard it ring, a surge of dread swept over me. It was not possible. Yet there it was, perched on the edge of my desk, shrieking like a desperate alert from the past. When I finally reached it that first night, my hand hovered above the receiver for an instant. My thoughts spun as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Then, with a trembling grip, I lifted the earpiece and pressed it against my ear. All I heard was a faint hiss, like static or wind passing through an old receiver. It sounded almost like a whisper without form, a breeze weaving through incomprehensible syllables. My breathing grew shallow, and I felt my lips go dry. The second I managed to ask who was there, my voice cracked with anxiety. There was no response, just more static, until it abruptly cut off. The phone line went silent, and I replaced the receiver, trying not to notice that my hands were shaking. In the morning, I attempted to reassure myself. Stress can make you imagine things, I thought. Or perhaps the ring I heard was some other device in the house. But I had lived in that place for long enough to recognize every beep of a fire alarm or hum of a dishwasher. That phone's ring was something else entirely. Even so, I convinced myself that maybe it had been a vivid dream, possibly spurred by a late-night snack or a half-remembered horror movie I'd watched. I decided to ignore the event, telling myself it was a fluke, and went about my daily routine. For 2 nights, the house was dead quiet. Still, I found myself glancing at the old phone before going to bed, practically daring it to ring again. The tension built inside me each time I did. My nerves were already on edge, my shoulders tensing every time the house settled or pipes creaked. On the 3rd night, at 3:17 a.m. by my bedside clock, the phone rang again. This time, the high-pitched tone sounded even louder, more urgent, as if demanding my attention. My stomach sank. The hammering of my heart almost blocked the sound, but I could not ignore it. I dragged myself to the office once more, each step feeling heavier than the last. My throat was so tight that my voice barely left my lips. When I picked up the receiver, sweat trickled along my temples. Again, there was that faint static, occasionally shifting into an inaudible murmur, like a voice drowned out by endless interference. No human language, no real clue. Just a vague sense that something was on the other end, trying and failing to communicate. The line went dead within seconds. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my uneven breaths. Then I carefully placed the receiver back. I checked the phone cord. It was still lying on the floor behind the desk, unattached to any jack. There was nothing to explain why it had rung. The next day, I confided in a friend. I told him I heard strange noises in my disconnected phone during the night, and that it felt like something was breathing on the other end. He responded that maybe I was hallucinating from lack of sleep, or that old electronics sometimes pick up radio signals by accident. He assured me it had to be some quirky mechanical glitch, not worth losing my mind over. I nodded along, but the rationalizations were starting to crumble under the weight of the events themselves. Something felt off, beyond mere technical faults or the swirl of my imagination. My attempts to dismiss the situation only led to a mounting sense of foreboding. I began noticing small, unsettling details around the house, as though the night's occurrences were leaving imprints, Sometimes I'd return from errands to find the office door slightly ajar, even though I remembered shutting it. A cold spot seemed to develop right behind my chair, as if an unseen presence hovered there. When I tried to focus on paperwork or watch videos on my computer, I kept feeling an odd tingle on the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched. Then came fleeting movements in my peripheral vision, like a shadow slipping behind the door frame. Whenever I glanced up, I was met only by the stillness of the hallway. It was during one of these unnerving days that I came up with the idea to record the phone at night. I wanted proof, both for myself and to quell the doubts of my friend. If the phone rang again, the camera on my cell phone would capture it. I set the phone up on a small tripod on my desk, pointed squarely at the landline. The evening was quiet enough. I almost thought nothing would happen. Then, right around 3:00 a.m., I heard that bone-chilling ring once again. My body reacted instantly. A jolt of adrenaline, a rush of blood that made my face flush, and the dryness in my mouth intensifying until I could barely swallow. My hands trembled as I dashed to the office, determined to catch it in the act. The moment I stepped in, the ringing thundered in my ears. My phone was just a few inches away, camera lens pointed at the antique device. I snatched the landline receiver, pressing it against my head. The static was fainter this time, but somehow more intense in its effect, as if multiple voices were whispering in a language just outside my understanding. My heart was pounding so hard it made my vision blur at the edges. I felt claustrophobic in my own home. By the time I uttered a shaky greeting, the static cut out entirely. Desperate to see what my cell phone had recorded, I scrambled to check the video. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the footage. It showed me standing there, obviously agitated, the old telephone pressed to my ear. But the recorded audio was silent. No ring, not even a hint of static. It was as though I were reacting to something that did not exist. Even my expression on camera looked strange. My eyes were wide and afraid, my shoulders stiff with tension, yet the phone in front of me never made a sound in the recording. It was like I was trapped in a personal nightmare that refused to be documented. The revelation that the phone's rings were audible only to me felt like a door slamming shut between me and reality. My rational mind rebelled. I wanted to believe there had to be an explanation, maybe an equipment malfunction or some bizarre electromagnetic interference. But how could that account for the missing sound in the video? And how was I consistently hearing it ring so loudly, so clearly, that it practically shook the walls? Over the following nights, my sleep became fitful. I woke at the slightest noise, constantly checking the time. The intervals between rings varied. Sometimes I went a full week without hearing anything, lulled into a false sense of security, only for the phone to burst into its nightmarish call at an unexpected hour. Each time my reaction grew more visceral. Cold sweat blanketed my body, and my mind screamed for the noise to stop. My nerves were stretched thin. I was consumed by the prospect of another ring, waiting for it like a condemned prisoner awaits a final sentence. The house itself seemed to conspire with the phone. Flickering lights in the hallway began to bother me. Some nights, the overhead lamp in my office would fizzle or dim as I walked in, as if responding to an unseen shift in the atmosphere. The floorboards groaned louder than usual, and a chill spread through the air. At times, the reflection in my office window appeared distorted, like the glass was warping. Once, I thought I caught a glimpse of a figure standing behind me in that reflection. But when I spun around, it vanished, leaving only the lingering dread that something might be inches from me, unseen. I stopped inviting friends over, partly because I feared the phone might ring and confirm my madness before their very eyes, and partly because I didn't know how to explain the creeping sense of unease that permeated every corner of my house. On a few occasions, I tried to ask for help indirectly, hinting that my home felt wrong, or that I suspected some unusual phenomena with old wiring. But my words sounded ridiculous, even to my own ears. I sensed their pitying looks. They thought I was overworked or grappling with insomnia. No one believed that an unplugged phone could ring in the dead of night. At times, I struggled to believe it myself, yet the evidence kept assaulting my senses. One evening, I decided to confront the phone directly. I placed it in the center of my desk, removed every cable in plain sight, and even unscrewed the back panel to make sure there was no hidden battery or transmitter. The metal and plastic guts of the device offered no secrets, just an old-fashioned circuit board and wires leading nowhere. I reassembled it carefully, my heart thudding with each screw replaced. Then I spoke under my breath, challenging whatever force lay behind this. My challenge sounded hollow in my own ears, more like an attempt at convincing myself I had some semblance of control. The same night the phone rang, louder than ever. The shriek was so piercing that it felt like my skull vibrated from within. I lunged to grab it and shouted a demand to speak clearly, but my words came out in a frightened rasp. The static that answered me seemed to shift in tone, almost as if it recognized my anger and was mocking me with a low, humming distortion. My eyes darted around the room, expecting to see something manifested in the corner. There was nothing but stale darkness, yet every hair on my neck remained on end, and a cold sweat clung to my back. It was the most acute sense of dread I had ever experienced, a primal terror that made it feel like something was hunting me. When it went silent, I held onto the phone for at least a minute more, trembling and struggling to catch my breath, as if letting go might set it off again. The following morning, I woke to find the antique phone knocked off my desk, coiled cord draped across the chair. Perhaps I had left it precariously balanced. Perhaps I had unknowingly brushed against it in my half-sleep. But the irrational part of me wondered if something unseen had moved it. My emotions teetered between disbelief and growing panic. Each night had become an exercise in survival. I couldn't rest, couldn't think about anything else. I began skipping social events, ignoring phone calls from friends on my mobile. The only phone that truly occupied my mind was that ancient rotary contraption that refused to be silent. A few days later, I tried one final experiment. I called a technician to inspect the phone lines in my house, though I told him it was for a different reason, that I was thinking of installing a landline and wanted to check the wiring. He assured me everything was disconnected, with no possibility of a stray current. After his inspection, he explained that the old jacks were basically dead. He was certain no calls could come in. I merely nodded, not knowing how to articulate the sheer terror that had become part of my nightly routine. Before he left, he made a light-hearted remark that I should get rid of such an outdated phone. I pretended to laugh. That night, I sat in my living room, determined not to give in to the dread. I tried reading, but every so often my gaze drifted toward the dark hallway that led to my office. My stomach churned with apprehension. The clock ticked softly, edging toward the dreaded hour. Eventually, I forced myself to walk to the office door. My throat was dry as sandpaper, and my heart pounded so insistently that I felt lightheaded. I reached out and flipped the light switch. The bulb flickered once, then held steady. There was the phone, back on the desk, silent and still. I stood there, waiting. Seconds turned into minutes. With each ticking moment, the tension in my body built, as though the air was charged with static. My breathing grew irregular, my palms clammy. I found myself staring at that phone, almost willing it to remain silent. Then, at precisely 3:22 a.m., it rang. The noise stabbed through me like a spear of sound. I wanted to run, but something told me this was it, the confrontation. I closed the door behind me, severing my path of escape, and walked up to the phone. This time, I was determined to confront whatever was on the other side. My arm felt numb as I lifted the receiver. A blast of static greeted me, followed by that impossible, half-formed whisper. It felt closer, more immediate, as if the speaker, if it could be called that, was in the room with me, not just on the other end of the line. My legs nearly gave out, and I braced myself against the desk. My stomach twisted, and a wave of nausea assaulted me. But I forced myself to speak, slowly and clearly, as though addressing a real person. I demanded to know what it wanted and pleaded for it to leave me alone. My own voice trembled at the edges, and my skin was clammy with terror. The static rose in pitch, swirling around my ears until I feared my eardrums would burst. Then, for a moment that stretched into eternity, all sound ceased. The phone fell silent. I placed the receiver down. My breath was ragged, but the house felt different, lighter. I waited, standing there in the dim light, expecting the phone to ring again. The second hand on the clock marched forward, and I found myself counting each beat. 5 seconds, 10, 30, a minute, 2 minutes. Nothing. My vision blurred with exhaustion. Eventually, I slid down to the floor, my back against the desk, letting out a shuddering exhale. Whatever confrontation had happened, whatever exchange had taken place, seemed to be over. I will never fully understand what occurred during those nights. I've considered every rational explanation and found them lacking. In the time since, I've worked hard to put the events behind me, but the memory of that ringing phone still haunts me. Sometimes in the early hours of the morning, I wake in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear the faint suggestion of a bell echoing through the hall. My heart seizes with dread until I confirm the silence. Although I've contemplated throwing the phone away, I haven't. Perhaps I'm afraid that discarding it would be an admission that something truly unnatural happened here. Or maybe I secretly fear that, no matter where I put it, if it decides to ring again, I would hear it regardless. I don't tell others about the phone anymore. I focus on my work, keep my schedule packed, and avoid lonely late-night hours in the office if I can help it. Yet every now and then, when darkness settles and my mind wanders, I recall the static-laced whisper that nobody else could hear. I remember my own voice echoing in that half-lit office, begging for silence. I feel that creeping dread like a phantom limb, reminding me that some things defy explanation. And in those moments, I glance at the old landline sitting quietly in its place, and a chill runs down my spine. Despite all I've done, I can't shake the feeling that it might ring again. And if it does, I'm not sure I have the courage to answer. I first noticed something was off the moment I entered my living room. The air felt heavier than usual, almost as though it were charged with a low-level static. I could have sworn the temperature dropped a few degrees the second I crossed the threshold. Nothing outwardly dramatic had happened yet, but that sudden chill in the air and the slight buzzing at the back of my neck seemed like an omen. Even the lights appeared dimmer, flickering almost imperceptibly, which made every shadow on the wall vibrate with disquieting potential. At the time, I tried to ignore it. It was just another ordinary evening, or so I told myself. I had invited a friend over for a few drinks and some long overdue conversation. We had done this countless times. He would typically sit on my couch while I went to the kitchen to fetch 2 cold beers. Usually, there was nothing particularly noteworthy or unsettling about the routine, but on this night, everything felt off-kilter from the start. After letting him in, I noticed his eyes dart around, as if he were sizing up the house. He settled on the sofa, looking a bit uneasy, but I chalked it up to work stress or some other personal matter he hadn't divulged. Wanting to lighten the mood, I excused myself to grab those beers from the fridge, hoping it would mellow both of us out. While I rummaged through the fridge, I heard the muffled sound of my friend calling my name from the living room. His tone was distinct, uneasy, almost startled. My pulse quickened. It was rare for him to sound so unsettled. Usually, he had a relaxed personality, the kind who would tease me about any stray thought or moment of paranoia I confessed. So when I heard that apprehensive inflection in his voice, my hands instinctively tightened around the beer bottles, and I felt a slight tremor pass through me. I took a deep breath before returning to the living room, forcing a casual expression onto my face. When I got back, I found him sitting upright, posture rigid, skin pale. His eyes were glued to the hallway that leads to my bedrooms, and he appeared to be holding his breath. He asked in a subdued, almost apologetic tone if I had a relative staying with me. That question made my stomach knot because I lived alone, a fact he knew well. I told him there was nobody else in the house. His face hardened with disbelief and discomfort. After a long pause, he admitted having glimpsed what he believed to be a tall, impossibly thin figure gliding down the corridor. He said he had only caught it for a second, but the sight was so vivid that he had assumed it was a house guest I simply had not mentioned. Hearing that made the small hairs on my arm stand up. The hallway was dimly lit, but hardly so dark as to conjure illusions, especially illusions that vivid. Despite the unsettling nature of his claim, I tried to remain composed. My friend added that he felt an intense dread wash over him, as though someone were standing right behind his shoulder, breathing down his neck. Though I made an attempt at rationalizing, I couldn't ignore the goosebumps spreading across my forearms. I felt something too, like a shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing inward, narrowing the space, amplifying the sensation of being watched. We shared a tense moment of silence. I tried to reassure him that it might be a trick of the light, or a fleeting shadow from the passing headlights of a car outside. But deep down, I knew he wasn't someone prone to flights of fancy. He was uncharacteristically rattled, and that rattled me in turn. The conversation drifted into half-hearted rationalizations. I could sense his restlessness growing, each explanation failing to soothe the apprehension in his eyes. Eventually he excused himself, saying he just didn't feel comfortable. There was no anger or accusation in his voice, only a quiet insistence that my house seemed to harbor something he couldn't explain. It almost looked like he was struggling to articulate exactly why he felt compelled to leave. As he made his way to the door, I noticed him glance over his shoulder several times, casting wary looks at the dim corridor. He kept rubbing at his arms, as though he felt a chill clinging to him. And then he left, all but sprinting out into the night. Standing alone in my now silent living room, I tried to deny the wave of anxiety that threatened to overwhelm me. I kept telling myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe a shadow had played a trick on him. Perhaps the tension of the day had put him on edge. But the worry lingered. I could practically hear my heart drumming in my chest, and it took several slow breaths to steady it. The fridge hummed in the kitchen, and the overhead light flickered just enough to make me wonder if I was imagining it. Over the next few nights, I began to notice subtle noises. At first, it was a soft tapping, as though someone were gently rapping on the walls with a single knuckle. Other times, I'd hear a hushed, scraping sound, faint and fleeting, impossible to pinpoint. I tried to ignore it, tried to bury my unease under the logic that old houses creak, pipes shift, and wind can cause all manner of strange vibrations. But these noises were too deliberate. I'd wake up in bed to the distinct impression that someone was pacing in the corridor. When I went to investigate, I'd find only stillness and silence, yet every time I turned my back, my skin would crawl with the sensation that something was lurking behind me. My friend refused to come back to my place. He made excuses, claimed he was busy, insisted we meet elsewhere if we wanted to hang out. His avoidance only magnified my own suspicions. It was as though a single event had opened a door in my mind, a door to a possibility I had never considered. I still tried to cling to skepticism, but each time I lay in the dark, listening to the soft moans of the house, I felt my grip on everyday reality slipping just a fraction. One particularly restless night, I found myself half awake around 3 a.m, that razor-thin line between dream and wakefulness. A strangled thud echoed from the direction of the corridor, followed by the faintest scrape against the floor. My heart pounded so fiercely that my ribcage felt bruised. Turning onto my side, I faced the open bedroom door, eyes straining against the darkness. I had left a small lamp on in the hallway, a desperate attempt to banish the unknown shapes that might lurk in the shadows. The corridor was dimly illuminated, just enough to see the doorway of the adjacent bedroom. Suddenly, the lamp flickered, and for a split second, I caught a silhouette pass by. It was tall, slender, and the movement was unnaturally smooth, almost gliding. Every muscle in my body tensed. The moment stretched into what felt like minutes, my breath caught in my throat. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The lamp's weak glow returned to its steady shimmer, and the corridor stood empty. I lay there, paralyzed by a cold sweat that seemed to have seeped into my very bones. My thoughts spiraled in a tornado of disbelief and dread. Could I have imagined that shape? Or had my friend's initial sighting planted a seed in my subconscious? Sleep became an impossibility for me after that. My days turned into a haze of cautious glances and muffled suspicion. I took to leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't even using, hoping it would break the suffocating darkness that seemed to breed these unsettling visions. I was determined not to give in to full-blown panic, but my nerves were shot. My appetite waned, and when I did eat, my mouth felt so dry that I had trouble swallowing. Friends and colleagues asked if I was feeling all right, noticing the dark circles under my eyes and the tremor in my voice. I made half-hearted excuses about stress and insomnia. Deep inside, though, I suspected something was profoundly wrong with the very place I called home. During this period, I started to experience episodes that I could only describe as fleeting hallucinations. Out of the corner of my eye, I would see movement in a mirror. Upon turning to look directly, there would be nothing but my own strained reflection. Sometimes the overhead lights seemed to dim and brighten, distorting the edges of the furniture and walls into sinister shapes. I caught myself jumping at my own shadow, feeling my pulse quicken at the slightest shift of light. My heart would throb, as though it wanted to burst out of my chest, and each jolt of panic left me shaky and drenched in sweat. Soon enough, I began to suspect that this presence, if it truly existed, wasn't just some random phenomenon. It was as if it were trying to get my attention, or toy with my sanity. Every now and then, in the quietest parts of the night, I sensed a pressure in the air, like a subtle electric charge. My ears would start ringing, my palms would break into a frigid sweat, and I would have to fight the urge to bolt out of the house without even putting on shoes. Yet I stayed, pinned by some mix of stubbornness and fear. A part of me simply refused to accept that my living space could be haunted or inhabited by something beyond my comprehension. I tried to recall if any strange events had happened in the home before my friend's visit. I searched my memory for any prior experiences that might offer an explanation, but all I could remember was the typical humdrum of life. Nothing stood out as a precursor to this creeping dread. Still, the notion that I was missing some crucial piece of the puzzle gnawed at me. Had I overlooked a subtle clue in the years I had spent living there? Or was it possible that my friend's sighting had somehow triggered these events, opening my mind to a reality I had been blind to before? Desperate for relief, I made the decision to sleep in the living room one night, hoping that changing my routine might stave off the restlessness. I set up pillows and blankets on the couch. The television cast a faint glow across the walls, its muted channels flickering in and out of static. I thought having a gentle noise in the background would distract me from the silence of the corridor, but around midnight, I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. The air grew stale, making it difficult to breathe. My stomach clenched with nausea, and goosebumps erupted along my arms. A soft scraping sound traveled from the hallway to the living room entrance. My heart thundered, and my throat felt so tight that I struggled to swallow. The noise drew closer, as if something were sliding across the floor, inch by inch. I sat upright, chest heaving with shallow breaths, eyes locked on the dark shape forming at the threshold. In the dim reflection of the TV's glow, I witnessed that elongated silhouette again. The features were impossible to discern, just an outline of inhuman thinness. There was a moment, a heartbeat in time, when it seemed to lean forward. Though I could see no eyes, I felt its stare boring into my skull, penetrating my every thought. My skin burned cold, and my fingers went numb. And then, as if satisfied by my terrified reaction, the shape receded into the shadows with a languid swiftness. I was left trembling on the couch, gasping for breath. The hiss of the TV's static felt deafening against the pounding in my ears. My entire body shook. My vision swam, and for a few seconds I questioned whether I was on the brink of losing my mind altogether. The next morning, I paced the house in a near panic, searching for any clue that could explain what I had seen. My mind raced with the possibility that there might be a hidden occupant in my home, some stranger or intruder living in the crawl spaces, evading detection. But no door or window showed signs of forced entry, and no closet or attic hatch looked disturbed. Every logical explanation dissolved under the weight of that spectral figure burned into my memory. As days passed, I made the decision that I could no longer live like this. Staying in the house felt like inviting a personal apocalypse of sleepless nights and constant apprehension. I packed a small bag of essentials, not entirely sure what I intended to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't spend another night enveloped by the dread that had practically become a living entity. On the evening of my departure, as I stood by the door, bag slung over my shoulder, a strange thought occurred to me. What if leaving wouldn't change anything? The presence felt as though it had attached itself to my consciousness, as if it thrived on my fear. Part of me worried it would follow me, plague me wherever I went. Despite that nagging worry, staying behind was no longer an option. My sanity was hanging by a thread, and the oppressive aura in the house was turning every quiet moment into a torment of expectation. I reached for the doorknob, trembling from head to toe. Before stepping outside, I glanced down the dark corridor one last time. My hand felt clammy, and my chest tightened as though an iron band were constricting my ribs. The corridor seemed still, silent, nothing visibly amiss. But I could sense a presence in that hush, a silent observer waiting for me to make a move. My mind swam with possibilities. Was I about to confront something real, or merely my own reflection of paranoia? With a ragged breath, I opened the door and left. To my surprise, the second I stepped out, the night air felt immediately soothing against my damp skin. It was as if I had broken free from a stale, suffocating bubble. My heartbeat gradually slowed, and the cool breeze helped clear my head. Even so, unease still coiled around my chest. I locked the door behind me and stood on the porch, uncertain if I would ever be able to return to that house in peace. The final glimpse I took over my shoulder showed nothing, yet my nerves remained raw, anticipating the slightest shift in the window curtains or the faint silhouette of that impossibly slender shape in the threshold. Everything remained dark. For a moment, I thought perhaps it was over, that acknowledging the horror and removing myself from the situation would banish it forever. But deep down, an uncomfortable possibility lingered. The sense that I was being watched, even out there in the open air, refused to subside entirely. I walked away, leaving the house behind me, but not the realization that something had shaken my understanding of reality. Whether it was supernatural or a product of my mind's fraying edges, it had managed to carve a permanent wound in my perception. Even as I drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back, and my hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles blanched. That was the final truth. No matter how far I traveled, a subtle part of me would always be glancing into the shadows, unable to truly unsee the shape my friend had witnessed and I had come to dread. The house stood silent behind me, and I had no guarantee that the thing lurking in its corridors would ever remain confined to its walls. But at least I was out for the moment, left only with the echo of a presence that had turned my life upside down. I still wonder if I'll return. Some nights, I catch myself thinking back to the flickering lights and the scraping sounds, half tempted to see if I imagined it all. But every time I consider going back to confirm or confront whatever made my house its home, my heart clenches with that same frantic beat it had when I first saw the silhouette. And in that moment, I know I'd rather wrestle with uncertainty than risk proving it was real all along. Because I'm not entirely convinced I'd leave a second time with my sanity intact. I noticed it the instant I stepped outside that evening. The air felt charged, as if the very atmosphere had shifted into something thick and suffocating. Even before I reached the short wooded path near my condominium, my senses were on edge. My pulse quickened, and an icy tingle spread through my limbs. I told myself it was just the thought of that poorly lit trail, notorious for giving people the creeps at night. But there was something else. Something far more oppressive than the familiar discomfort of dark, enclosed spaces. It was as if the trees themselves were radiating a silent warning. You are not alone. Go back. I live in a relatively quiet condominium complex on the outskirts of a suburban neighborhood. The place is peaceful during the day, and a communal sense of security is palpable. Families move about, neighbors chat near their doorsteps, and the greenery is well kept. A short but dense wooded path cuts through this complex to a small convenience store on the other side, allowing residents to avoid a longer walk around the block. In sunlight, it's almost picturesque. Tall trees swaying in the breeze, a neatly maintained dirt trail free of debris, and soft chirping from the birds that nest overhead. Yet once dusk sets in, that path becomes unrecognizable. The canopy grows darker. Even the slightest breeze rustles branches in a menacing way, and the flickering light from the nearest street lamp barely penetrates the gloom. One night, about a week ago, I was in a hurry to pick up something from the store. It was already past sunset, but the idea of walking around the main streets felt like a hassle. Against my better judgment, I decided to take the shortcut through the trees. As soon as I stepped under that canopy, I felt a prickly sensation at the back of my neck, goosebumps rising even though the night was fairly warm. With each step, my breathing grew heavier. The air seemed stagnant and oddly warm, as if there was no circulation. Halfway through, I had the distinct impression I was being followed. It wasn't a definite sound, more of a presence, a sense that something loomed in my peripheral vision. I tried glancing behind me a few times, but I couldn't see anything. I was alone, yet my heart pounded as though a stranger stood mere inches away. That first experience ended the moment I emerged onto the well-lit street. My lungs expanded in relief, and the tension dissolved into the night air. I caught my reflection in a store window, sweaty brow, wide eyes, and an unsteady posture. I dismissed it, telling myself I had let my imagination get the best of me. But something lingered in my mind. That trailing footstep feeling, the heaviness of a gaze I couldn't place. When I returned home, I tried brushing it off, refusing to let a spooky walk overshadow my sense of reason. Over the following days, I casually brought it up with a couple of neighbors. Without going into too much detail, I mentioned that I felt uneasy passing through the wooded path after dark. Several of them admitted the same discomfort. One neighbor recounted in low whispers that he sometimes heard what sounded like faint breathing behind him. Another insisted she once saw a shifting shadow among the trunks, but turned to find only stillness. These secondhand accounts made my skin crawl. Each time I heard a new story, I felt a faint flutter of dread in my stomach, as if confirming that the path harbored something intangible, yet undeniably real. I tried to ignore it for a while. I avoided late-night trips and stuck to the main sidewalk if I had errands in the evening. Yet that trail remained a thorn in my thoughts, plaguing me with curiosity. Was it just our collective imaginations feeding on rumors? Or was there something genuinely wrong? Late at night, if I stood on my balcony, I could see the faint outline of the treetops. They stood so quietly in the moonlight, an unmoving barricade hiding who knew what. Sometimes I would stare for minutes at a time, half expecting to spot a figure shifting among the branches. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. A few nights later, I deliberately set out after sundown, determined to walk that path again and prove to myself that my fears were unfounded. My plan was simple: maintain a steady pace, keep my eyes forward, and ignore any peripheral illusions. The moment I neared the entrance, however, every hair on my body stood on end. The daylight tranquility was gone, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt wrong. Even the usual hum of distant traffic seemed muted. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly bone dry, and stepped onto the dirt trail. With each step, I became acutely aware of my heartbeat thumping in my ears. My legs felt heavy, as if I were marching through sand. There was an odor in the air, a damp, earthy smell mixed with something metallic that I couldn't identify. The path itself was dimly lit by a single lamppost at the entrance, but a few feet in, the canopy thickened, casting the trail in near darkness. Shadows jostled across the dirt and foliage, forming shapes that danced at the edges of my vision. Halfway through, I felt that presence again. It was the same sensation as before, but this time it felt sharper, almost tangible. The back of my neck prickled like an electric current buzzed through my nerves. My breath quickened, and I forced myself not to turn around. Every instinct screamed that something was right behind me. So close I swore I could hear faint exhalations just out of sync with my own ragged breathing. My mind began to race. If I looked, would I see an outline? If I ran, would it chase me? I tried to rationalize, tried to conjure a logical explanation. Maybe it was the wind in the trees or an animal scuttling through the brush. But rational thought was losing ground to overwhelming paranoia. In a surge of self-preservation, I picked up my pace. The leaves crunched loudly underfoot, and I realized the noises I was making drowned out any external sounds. Could that presence, whatever it was, be inching closer without me noticing? My skin broke out in a cold sweat, and I noticed my hands were shaking. As I finally broke through to the other side, stumbling onto the sidewalk illuminated by streetlights, I looked back. The path looked innocent from that vantage point, just a quiet trail flanked by tall, dark trees. But somewhere in those shadows, I sensed a silent watcher. I caught my breath, leaning against a street lamp, heart hammering like I'd just escaped some lurking predator. That night I didn't linger. I headed straight to the store, bought what I needed, and returned home via the main road, even though it took longer. The tension only subsided once I was back in my apartment, door locked behind me. Yet the memory refused to fade. My mind replayed the walk over and over, fixating on every rustle, every flicker of movement at the edges of my vision. The following day, I woke with a slight headache, the result of restless sleep and jangled nerves. Determined to break the spell this path had on me, I decided to talk more openly with some neighbors and friends from the condominium. In a calm voice, I explained the unsettling feeling of being followed. Through hushed, almost embarrassed confessions, I learned that the phenomenon was surprisingly widespread. Reports of invisible footsteps, oppressive silence, and the sense of being watched. A few people insisted it was just a trick of the mind, perhaps triggered by the environment, a naturally eerie setting. Others hinted that there might be a spiritual or paranormal explanation. One individual even mentioned hearing faint whispers in an unfamiliar language, but since he never went back, he couldn't confirm if it was real or just his imagination. Now, whenever I pass near the entrance at night, even if I'm not planning to walk through, my entire body tenses. It's like some primal part of my brain recognizes a threat. The rational side of me is both fascinated and terrified by this. On some level, I want to confront whatever lurks there, to drag it out into the open so I can see it and define it. Yet I'm also afraid that, if I do that, I'll open a door I might regret. More nights passed, and my curiosity festered. I began to experience nightmares. The dreams weren't always the same, but they shared a recurring theme. I'd be on that trail, surrounded by towering trees that swayed without any wind. A shape flickered behind me, a silhouette that melted into the darkness whenever I turned around. Sometimes I'd smell that metallic odor. Other times I'd hear faint clicking sounds, like fingernails tapping on wood. I'd wake up clammy and short of breath, certain the presence from the path had followed me into my own room. The psychological toll was becoming too great. Even my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked haunted, eyes ringed with shadows, jaw perpetually clenched. One evening, fueled by an odd mix of determination and dread, I decided to walk the trail once more, but this time with my phone's flashlight at the ready. If anything moved in my periphery, I planned to flood the area with bright light. I told a friend about my plan, and he gave me a nervous nod, wishing me luck without saying much more. He didn't try to talk me out of it. Our eyes met briefly, both reflecting the same uncertainty. Just after 10 o'clock, I made my way to the wooded path. The night sky was moonless, and a slight breeze rustled the tree branches, filling the air with hissing whispers. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness, illuminating the ground but leaving the tall trunks around me half hidden, half revealed. After a dozen steps, I caught a flicker of movement to my right. Heart pounding, I swept the flashlight in that direction, revealing only a rough patch of bark and some low-hanging leaves. My mind screamed, that something had been there a second ago. I continued, forcing each breath in and out, feeling my pulse reverberate in my fingertips. In the flashlight's glow, I noticed how the dirt path looked oddly disturbed, as if it had been churned recently. My foot slid on a damp patch of earth and I nearly lost my balance. The smell in the air was stronger tonight, earthy decay laced with that strange metallic tang. It filled my nostrils, making me slightly nauseous. Suddenly, I heard a scraping sound behind me. It was faint, but unmistakable. Something brushing against the trunk of a tree, or maybe dragging along the ground. I spun around, the flashlight jittering from my trembling hand. The beam swept across a cluster of bushes, revealing only rustling leaves. For a moment, I thought I saw a tall silhouette between the tree trunks. But before my brain could register its shape, it seemed to dissolve into the darkness. A surge of panic shot through me, and a wave of cold sweat rolled down my back. My vision blurred at the edges, and my breathing turned shallow. If I stayed any longer, I felt certain I would lose my grip on sanity. Summoning every last shred of courage, I aimed the flashlight ahead and broke into a staggered run, desperate to reach the other side. The path felt longer than I remembered, as if it had stretched to trap me within. My arms and legs tingled with fear, muscles stiff with adrenaline. When I finally burst onto the lit sidewalk, it felt like surfacing from underwater. My lungs gulped in the cool night air, and the world gained clarity again. Behind me, the path gaped like an open maw, black and inscrutable. My heart still hammered, and the aftershock of terror left me dizzy. I took a few steps away from the entrance, refusing to even glance back. For the next several nights, I avoided that stretch of woods entirely. Yet the presence felt more intrusive than ever, as if it had taken up residence in my subconscious. Sometimes, standing on my balcony, I thought I saw flickers of movement among the treetops. On one occasion, I heard a rasping sound echoing in the distance, carried on the wind. I couldn't be sure if it was real, or if my rattled nerves were toying with me. Either way, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. The final straw came when I noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere around the condominium itself. Even during the day, residents seemed more guarded. People glanced over their shoulders, as though expecting something to materialize at any moment. The cheerful spirit that once permeated our little community had waned, replaced by a collective unease. Though few spoke openly about it, we all sensed an invisible pressure in the air. I made up my mind to confront the reality of the situation, not by walking the path alone again, but by acknowledging that there are things we might never understand lurking in ordinary places. One evening, I stood at the edge of the trail, bathed in the yellowish glow of a street lamp. My body tensed with the memory of that suffocating darkness. My heart pounded, and sweat beaded at my temples. Yet I didn't enter. Instead, I peered into the blackness, silently challenging whatever lay in wait. My head throbbed with the tension of that stare down, like the forest was staring right back at me. I had a profound sense that if I ventured in again, I might not come out the same, even if I remained physically unharmed. So, I chose to respect that boundary. There are places that emanate a subtle malevolence, and sometimes the only way to preserve your sanity is to keep your distance. The trail is still there, of course, a convenient shortcut during the day, a stretch of shadow and uncertainty at night. And sometimes, when I walk by that entrance after sundown, every nerve in my body flares in a warning. Even at a glance, I can feel it. Something remains hidden among those trees. I don't know if it's supernatural or simply the product of too many fearful minds. But the dread is real, clinging to me like a second skin whenever I get too close. I haven't decided if I'll ever test my resolve again. Part of me wants to, just to prove that I can walk those woods without losing myself to terror. Another part of me whispers that I've seen and felt enough. Maybe that's the real horror, knowing that it's there, unseen, but always present. Even now, as I stand in the safety of a well-lit street, my heart thrums with the memory of that dense, suffocating dark, and my stomach knots in a primal warning. I can leave the path alone, but I can never truly rid myself of the sense that something is watching from that silent grove of trees, waiting, patient, unrelenting. No matter where I go from here, the mere thought of that wooded shortcut under the moonless sky sends an icy shiver down my spine. I don't need to see it to know it's there, and that, I think, is what truly haunts me. From the instant I carried the old clock into my apartment, a sharp chill settled along the back of my neck. The hallway light seemed dimmer, and every sound, from the soft hum of the refrigerator to the distant traffic outside, grew unnervingly louder, as though the world were holding its breath. Even before I hung it on the wall, I sensed an intrusion into my space, an invader disguised behind that polished wooden casing. It was strange how an inanimate object could radiate such disquiet. I almost convinced myself that I was overreacting, but I couldn't dismiss the uncanny heaviness in the air. That night was only the beginning of a series of events that would haunt me and leave me questioning every shadow, every flicker, every muted breath. I had taken the clock from a friend of mine who claimed it had once belonged to his father's workshop. I remember my friend mentioning it in passing one afternoon, pointing out that it was collecting dust in a corner and that he had no plans of using it. He figured I had an appreciation for vintage items, so he offered it to me. I felt a certain attraction to its ornate design, an elegant face with golden numerals, beautifully carved hands that suggested a delicate craftsmanship lost in our modern world. Its wooden frame, though worn, still carried subtle remnants of fine detail, curling flourishes along the edges, and a small metal plate that read, 1923. He told me it had been completely non-functional for decades. The internal gears had seized up, and the old pendulum was more decorative than anything else. When I first brought it home, I didn't notice anything overtly unusual about it, aside from the aura of antiquity. It had no battery slot for modern convenience, just a place where one might wind it with a key. According to my friend, that key was long lost. He told me that no matter how many times they had tried to fix the mechanism, it refused to come back to life. Something was rusted in the innermost workings, and the clock was, for all intents, just an heirloom suitable as a nostalgic decoration. And at first I fully believed that. I hung it carefully on a plain stretch of wall in my living room, directly opposite the only window. Its pendulum hung motionless in its chamber of dusty glass. I can still picture the first moment I stepped back to admire how it looked. The wood gleamed faintly in the overhead light, and I recall feeling a slight tightness in my chest, an unexplainable sense that the atmosphere had grown heavier. That same night, the nightmares started. I found myself restless, tossing and turning in my bed, every tiny creak of the building magnified by my racing thoughts. There was a moment, right around 1:37 in the morning, when the quiet was suddenly shattered by a single resonant chime. My eyes snapped open and I instinctively held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard it felt as though it might break through my ribs. I lay there in disbelief, listening to the echo fade into a silence that felt thicker than before. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the clock's old gears had shifted due to some minute temperature change. Though the chime had been distinct enough to stop my heart, I told myself it must be a stray mechanical glitch. Yet, my instincts flared, warning me that something was amiss. I waited, half expecting another chime, half dreading it. When none came, I pushed the incident to the back of my mind, reassuring myself that it was a one-time occurrence. At the same time, there was a subtle tingling behind my ears, as though the air itself vibrated with hidden tension. I soon found it impossible to fall back asleep. The following day, I felt unsettled in my own home. The morning sun spilling through the window should have chased away my worries, but it didn't. The apartment seemed somehow darker, even under natural daylight. My coffee tasted bitter, and a jittery anxiety roamed through my veins. I kept glancing at the clock, verifying that it was still as inert as ever. The hands hadn't moved. The pendulum was just as still. And yet, the memory of that singular chime lingered in my mind, prickling at my skepticism. For a moment, I even considered removing the clock from the wall, as though ridding myself of it would banish the weird apprehension. But I chose to ignore my instincts, something I would soon regret. That next evening played out in the same ominous fashion. I settled into bed, trying to dismiss the tension I felt each time I glanced at my phone to check the time. As 1:37 approached, my heart rate climbed, and I realized how ridiculous it was to lie there, waiting for a noise from something that was supposedly broken. I tried to breathe deeply, focusing on the sound of my own inhalations to drown out my racing thoughts. My pulse thundered in my ears and sweat began to accumulate along my temples. Then it happened again. At exactly 1:37, the bell rang out through the silent apartment, a single note that seemed to resonate far longer than it should have. My mouth went dry. Every hair on my arms prickled with static. And for those few seconds, I was paralyzed by a fear that had no logical basis. The apartment's silence afterward felt like a smothering blanket, thick and unforgiving. Over the following nights, the event repeated itself with a cold precision that made my skin crawl, always at 1:37. Never more than one chime. Each time, my chest would tighten, my eyes would dart around the dark room, and I'd become convinced that something lurked in the corners of my vision. Several times, I got up and stumbled through the dark, flipping on lights, peering into the living room to confirm that the clock's hands hadn't shifted. They never did. The second hand remained frozen. The gears inside looked as lifeless as they did when I first inspected them. Yet the chime remained consistent, unwavering. I tried to talk myself into believing there was a rational explanation. I told a colleague from work that maybe the clock had some leftover spring tension or a hidden winding mechanism. He suggested I record the noise to gather evidence. I decided to do just that, setting up my phone to film at 1:30 in the morning. But all I managed to capture was a muffled resonance that seemed to emanate from the clock's direction, though the pendulum and hands never moved. My colleague offered to come over one night to experience it for himself. He was curious, and so was I. I remembered his exact words. He was convinced that if he heard the chime, he could help me figure out a mechanical cause. So, one Friday, I invited him to stay the night. We shared a late dinner in my kitchen, both anticipating the early morning spectacle that lay ahead. I recall the look on his face when it happened. The living room lights were off. We were both sitting there in the darkness. My pulse was racing as the clock flipped from 1:36 to 1:37 on my phone's screen. The chime struck the air like a shockwave, causing us both to jolt in our seats. My hands turned clammy, and my friend admitted that he too felt a chill run up his spine. He murmured that it sounded unearthly, almost like it was echoing from inside the walls. He later confided in me that he thought he saw a faint flicker, as if a shadow had passed from the hallway into the kitchen. He remarked that the atmosphere in my apartment was suffocating, that the quiet was unnatural, pressing into his eardrums until they ached. We investigated every corner of the place and found nothing, of course. The clock was just as lifeless when we checked. No gears moving, no signs of tampering. Although neither of us wanted to say it outright, I could sense we both feared something beyond rational explanation. My colleague left early the next morning. He couldn't hide his unease, and he hinted that I should consider getting rid of the clock altogether. He said I could return it to my friend or store it somewhere out of sight, but I had a stubborn determination to find answers. Part of me refused to let this phenomenon remain unsolved, even as my mental state became more and more fraught. Over the subsequent days, my paranoia intensified. I found myself rushing home after work, not because I was eager to be in my apartment, but because I wanted to observe the space before the nightly chime. The sense of being watched trailed behind me like a persistent shadow. In the evenings, I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Nothing substantial, just fleeting shapes. The back of my neck prickled constantly. My heart rate would spike at random intervals. Sometimes it felt like the air in the apartment was compressing, making it laborious to breathe. I even started leaving the lights on in the hallway at night, hoping that the illumination might dispel whatever was making me so uneasy. It never worked. If anything, the stark light only made the shadows sharper. One weekend I took the clock off the wall and tried to examine its internal components. The back panel was sealed shut with small rusted nails that I managed to pry loose with a screwdriver. Inside, I found a labyrinth of gears, spindles, and cogs. Most of them were corroded, and some had a thin layer of dust and grime. It all looked inert. No hidden electronics, no modern alterations. I tapped the gears lightly with the tip of my screwdriver. They didn't budge. I even tried to turn the largest gear by hand, but it was locked tight, unyielding. There was no obvious reason for any movement, let alone a perfectly timed chime. After I closed it back up and hung it on the wall, a powerful wave of dread swept over me. As if by prying into its innards, I had somehow awakened something deeper. The air around me felt heavier, each breath a strain. My vision blurred for a few seconds. A low hum buzzed in my ears, and for one heart-stopping moment, I could have sworn the pendulum gave a tiny swing. But when I looked again, it was as still as ever. That night, sleep was impossible. I felt an almost electric tension crackling in the room. Sometime around 1:20, I started shivering uncontrollably. My hands were clammy, my breathing quick and shallow. I watched the digits on my phone crawl toward 1:37, every second stretching into an agonizing eternity. When the clock finally chimed, it tore through the silence so fiercely that I nearly cried out. My chest constricted, my scalp tingled, and my entire body tensed up as though expecting a physical attack. The single note reverberated with a power I couldn't understand. I felt pinned to the bed by the sheer force of dread. In that overwhelming darkness, I heard a faint creak from the living room, a slow, deliberate sound that reminded me of footsteps on old floorboards. I lay there, paralyzed, the sweat on my forehead turning ice cold. The steps never repeated, but I couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was just on the other side of my door. In the morning, I found the living room light off, even though I was certain I had left it on before going to bed. The seat cushion on the couch seemed slightly indented, as though someone had sat there for a while. My entire body felt drained, and there was a sour taste in my mouth from a night's worth of fear. I felt dangerously on edge, as though my nerves were raw, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I caught myself pacing aimlessly around the apartment, my heart seizing at the smallest noise. The hum of the fridge, the groan of the walls settling, the click of the overhead lights. Eventually, I decided I had to confront the situation more directly. I planned to stay up until 1:37 with every light in the apartment on. I was determined to watch the clock at the exact moment it struck, to see if there was any sign of mechanical motion. That night, I brewed multiple pots of strong coffee and forced myself to remain alert. My foot tapped anxiously on the floor. Every nerve in my body felt taut, like a bowstring pulled to its limit. The overhead lights cast sharp shadows along the walls, revealing the smallest imperfections in the paint. I refused to blink as 1:36 turned to 1:37. Right on cue, the chime erupted. My stomach twisted so violently that I nearly dropped my coffee. I stared unblinkingly at the clock face. Nothing moved. Not a single gear, not a single hand. But this time, something else happened. In the midst of that resounding note, the reflection on the glass covering the clock changed. For a brief second, I saw the shape of a face, pale, with hollows where the eyes should have been. It wasn't mine. The reflection vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me gasping and trembling, my lungs hungry for air. I stumbled backward, gripping the edge of a bookshelf to keep from collapsing. My skin was clammy with sweat, my fingertips going numb. A wave of panic crashed over me, and I felt the walls tightening in. It dawned on me that whatever was attached to this clock wasn't just some mechanical trick. It felt alive in the worst possible way. That revelation snapped something in me. I didn't want this entity, real or imagined, in my life anymore. With frantic energy, I unhooked the clock from the wall, ignoring the piercing ring that still reverberated in my ears. The wooden casing felt unnaturally cold against my hands. My pulse hammered in my temples, and I had the sudden urge to fling the clock to the ground and smash it to pieces. But a stronger sense of self-preservation held me back. I was terrified that destroying it might unleash something I couldn't contain. I placed the clock in a large cardboard box, sealed it with packing tape, and shoved it into the closet. As I did so, a suffocating dread gripped me. My mind conjured images of the clock continuing to chime in the darkness of the closet, each note throbbing through the closed door. The rest of the night I cowered in my bedroom, half expecting to hear that bell again. Yet for the first time in weeks, 1:37 passed without any sound. The deafening silence of the apartment left me tense, but oddly relieved. The next morning, I barely recognized myself in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, ringed by dark circles. My skin looked sallow. My body felt weighed down by days of accumulating terror. But for the first time in a while, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe isolating the clock was enough to break its grip. I couldn't bear the thought of returning it to my friend. It was as though giving this cursed item back would only pass the burden on to someone else. Instead, I decided to get rid of it entirely. I didn't care about the clock's antique value or sentimental worth. It wasn't worth the toll on my sanity. That afternoon, I loaded the box into my car. My palms were sweaty on the steering wheel, my heartbeat erratic. Each mile seemed to stretch on forever, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone in the back seat. Finally, I pulled into the parking lot of a storage facility on the outskirts of town. I didn't want it anywhere near my apartment, nor did I feel comfortable throwing it in the trash, as if that might somehow fail to contain its presence. My plan was to rent a small storage locker and leave it there indefinitely, so I did just that. The small metal unit smelled of stale air. I placed the box in a corner, stepping away quickly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. A tremor rattled my arms as I locked the unit shut. That night, my apartment was eerily calm. I no longer felt that oppressive weight bearing down on me. I was able to sleep, though uneasily, and with the lights on. When 1:37 came, I jolted awake, bracing for the chime. Only silence met my ears. I can't describe the relief that moment brought, though it was mixed with residual dread, a leftover anxiety from the preceding weeks. Even now, the memory of that bell haunts me. I still wake at precisely 1:37 some nights. My body braced for a terror that no longer arrives. The silence that follows is almost painful, as though my ears yearn for confirmation of the clock's presence. On occasion, I wonder if I should check on the storage locker to see if the box remains where I left it. But I haven't mustered the courage. Part of me fears that the chime might somehow follow me again. Or worse, that if I open the box, I'll see those empty eyes in the reflection of the clock's glass once more. In my living room, the vacant space on the wall where the clock used to hang remains a reminder of that unsettling chapter. Sometimes I stand there, staring at the outlines of dust that formed around where the clock's frame once rested, and my pulse quickens. The psychological scars haven't fully healed. I still question how much of it was real, and how much was my mind distorting everyday phenomena. Yet I know what I felt. The cold dread, the suffocating silence, the deep vibrations of that single, unearthly chime reverberating through my bones. That kind of fear doesn't vanish overnight. I haven't heard from the entity, or presence, or whatever it was since I banished the clock. But the lingering uncertainty is always with me, creeping in when the lights are low or when sleep won't come easily. My friend eventually asked about the clock, wondering if I liked its vintage look. I told him indirectly that it didn't suit my apartment after all, and that I decided to store it away. He shrugged it off, seemingly oblivious to the horrors it caused. I didn't delve into details, not wanting to relive those moments or invite anything back into my life. Occasionally, just before drifting off, I recall the echo of that chime. I feel the skin on my arms tighten, and a vague nausea stirs in my gut. My mind replays the bizarre reflection in the glass and the phantom creaking of footsteps. I remember the suffocating sense that something ancient and watchful had fixed its attention on me. And although it remains imprisoned in that storage locker, I doubt it has truly gone dormant. There's a small but stubborn part of me that can't shake the feeling that the clock is more than a mere object, that it bides its time in darkness, anticipating the hour when it can once again exert its silent pull on my life. Tonight, I find myself fighting the urge to check the time, battling the dread that 1:37 might still hold power over me. Though the clock is gone, the memory persists, like a wound that refuses to fully close. And in the stagnant hush of these late-night hours, I can't help but question whether one day I'll hear that single chime again, echoing from the recesses of my mind, or perhaps from somewhere far more real.